The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will now come to order. Today, the subcommittee is holding a hearing entitled EPA Enforcement Taking the Environmental Cop Off the Beat. The purpose of today's hearing is to explore trends in enforcement measures during the Trump administration and whether the EPA is ensuring consistent enforcement and implementation of federal environmental regulations and laws, as well as resulting impacts on human health and the environment. The chair recognizes herself for the purpose of an opening statement. For decades, this Oversight and Investigations panel has worked to ensure that the Environmental Protection Agency is doing its job, including enforcement of our nation's environmental laws. This work continues today. It's important to remember that when we talk about enforcement, what we're really talking about is protecting our environment and our health from polluters. We're talking about keeping our rivers and waterways clean and harmful pollutants out of the air that each and every one of us breathes. If the EPA isn't enforcing the laws that we already have on the books, then we all pay the price. Unfortunately, the price that some of us pay is greater than others, as some of our nation's bigger polluters are often located in or near minority and low-income communities. We have a responsibility to care for them, as we do every single person who calls America home. And ensuring the EPA is doing its job and holding polluters accountable is critical towards protecting their health and well-being. Now, I understand that enforcing our environmental laws can often be a long and intensive process. I also understand that there's not one single measurement that can be used to accurately evaluate the agency's overall efforts to enforce our laws in any given year. That said, there are some indicators that are more telling than others, and when combined with others, can help to paint a pretty clear picture of what's really going on. The numbers you'll hear today are from the EPA's own Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance and were included in a report released earlier this month detailing the agency's 2018 enforcement and compliance activities. I'm sure that the EPA will try to use these numbers today to paint a rather rosy interpretation of the enforcement efforts last year. And probably they'll talk about how proud they are of everything they did last year. But what I see when I look at this report is an agency that's simply just sitting on its hands. I see an agency that's giving polluters a free pass, and it's putting our health and our environment at risk. When EPA enforcement activities go down, pollution goes up. That's just a fact. And the latest numbers from the EPA show its overall enforcement activities for 2018 were at historically low levels. For example, and again, this is according to the agency's own numbers, in fiscal year 2018, the EPA assessed polluters a total of $69 million in civil penalties. $69 million. That's the lowest level of penalties assessed to polluters since the EPA created the Office of Enforcement over 20 years ago in 1994. Now again, I understand that enforcement efforts can often take months or even years to complete, and that some of that work done in 1 year may not be accurately reflected in the overall total for any given year. But the numbers seem to indicate a disturbing trend. And while no one factor can tell the whole story, there are some indicators that when taken together can help us paint a pretty clear picture of EPA's overall efforts to enforce our laws. For example, the total number of facilities that the EPA inspected last year is the lowest since 1994. The total number of civil cases it initiated is the lowest since 1982. And the number of cases it referred to the Department of Justice, the lowest since 1976, my freshman year in college. So, while I'd like to sit here and believe that the EPA is serious about enforcing our federal environmental laws, it's hard to ignore the facts. And it's hard to ignore headline after headline, which suggests the opposite. For example, Washington Post, quote, under Trump, EPA inspections fall to a 10-year low. New York Times, quote, EPA enforcement drops sharply in Trump's second year in office. NBC News, quote, EPA criminal action against polluters hits 30-year low under Trump. Christian Science Monitor, quote, has the EPA lost its teeth? So if the EPA isn't enforcing our environmental laws, who is? If the EPA isn't acting as the nation's environmental watchdog that it was created to be, then it's just simply not acting in the best interest of the American taxpayers. The question is why? Why is the EPA sitting on the sidelines? Based on data provided by the agency, the EPA has cut at least 17% of the personnel. And that doesn't even include the personnel of the 10 regional offices. We're also going to hear that the people who have remained at the EPA are facing even greater challenges when trying to perform their laws. Congress can do something about this. We need to require compliance. That's why we're having this hearing, and that's why we expect the EPA to do its job. So, I'm looking forward to the testimony today. I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody. And at this point, I'm now happy to recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, for holding this important hearing today. Congress has enacted several important laws to protect the environment and human health, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, is responsible for working within its state, tribal, and federal partners to help to put these laws into effect. The EPA must develop and enforce environmental regulations for laws such as Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, to name just a few. I am encouraged by EPA's commitment to assuring compliance with these important environmental laws and want to thank the thousands of federal and state workers who have spent countless hours helping to achieve these goals. Every few years, there seems to be a major enforcement action resulting in a substantial amount of penalties and fines. For example, the 2013 enforcement numbers included a settlement with BP following the devastating 2010 Gulf of Mexico spill. Similarly, the 2017 enforcement numbers included the record Volkswagen Clean Air Act civil settlement. In this year, fiscal year 2019, the numbers will include the Fiat Chrysler settlement finalized just last month. In fact, the dollar amount for civil, judicial, administrative penalties in the fiscal year 2019 is on track to be one of the largest ever. These enforcement actions are extremely important to help protect the environment, ensure compliance with federal laws and regulations, and are the type of enforcement action the federal government is best suited to pursue rather than the states. But the large fine amounts in certain years does not mean the agency and its partners are any less diligent about protecting the environment in any other years where these large settlements do not occur. Therefore, while monitoring enforcement actions is an important tool to promote compliance with environmental laws and regulations, it is important that we don't lose sight of the most important goals, which are protecting the environment and protecting human health. This administration has emphasized the need to focus on compliance and ensure that a broad range of compliance assurance tools are available for use by the agency. We have a lot of questions today about what EPA is doing to promote compliance and how programs such as the self-disclosure violations policies can help achieve compliance. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how the EPA is working with states to promote state primacy and authorized programs. As we all know, the EPA works in collaboration with states and tribal organizations to conduct inspections and enforcement. In 2017, the EPA formed a work group with the Environmental Council of the states to develop principles and best practices for state and EPA collaboration on a number of issues, such as inspections and enforcement. The working group issued their final report in August 2018. I've heard that these initiatives are working and that states are beginning to feel like they have a seat at the table. The EPA also works with other federal agencies when enforcing some of the environmental laws. That's one reason I'm glad we have the Honorable Ron Tempest on the second panel. Mr. Tempest previously served as an Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And it will be helpful to hear how the Environment and Natural Resources Division at DOJ works with the EPA to ensure robust enforcement of our nation's environmental laws. I think we can all agree that the desired outcome of any compliance program is to prevent pollution and protect our environment for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. I'm looking forward to hearing about how the EPA is working to accomplish these goals. Considering the ebb and flows of enforcement fines and penalties within an administration, let alone between administrations, I hope we don't get ahead of ourselves today and imply that 1 year of slightly lower enforcement accomplishment signals that EPA is not doing its job or ensuring compliance with our nation's environmental laws. And I yield back.
Thank you. The chair will now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, the committee begins critical oversight of the Trump's EPA enforcement program, something that the previous Republican majority ignored. Congress can pass all the legislation it wants to protect against air pollution, contaminated drinking water, and hazardous chemical risks, but ultimately the EPA must implement and enforce those laws. It's therefore impossible to assess EPA's effectiveness without looking at whether the agency is enforcing the federal environmental statutes that are already on the books. And there's no doubt that the Trump EPA's enforcement record is abysmal, the worst in decades. Over the past few weeks, news reports suggest that EPA is simply not maintaining the type of vigorous enforcement that is needed to protect our environment and communities from the worst polluters. For example, a report in the Christian Science Monitor found that the number of inspections conducted by the agency in 2018 were the lowest since records began in 1994. It also reported that the number of civil cases initiated by the EPA was the lowest since 1982, and the number of judicial referral cases for 2018 was 110. That's less than half the average annual number of 239. There's no way to sugarcoat these numbers. It appears that the Trump EPA is relying on industry to voluntarily come forward and disclose when they're not in compliance. Nobody here can really believe that the worst offenders of environmental laws would voluntarily come forward to disclose their violations. EPA must have a robust enforcement presence. The agency needs to actively conduct investigations to determine whether violations are occurring. It needs to inspect facilities, start cases, and where appropriate, refer cases to the Department of Justice. And the EPA needs to issue penalties that not only make polluters pay when they break the law, but also force polluters to come into compliance so that they're no longer in violation. And it takes a lot of people to do all of this difficult and resource-intensive work, but unfortunately the number of staff in the enforcement office has continued to drop over the years. This is not surprising, considering President Trump promised to reduce the agency on the campaign trail to, I quote, little tidbits, and then attempted to fulfill that threat by proposing a nearly 23% budget cut last year. Now, Congress did not let President Trump's draconian proposal take effect, but industry heard loud and clear that this president was not prioritizing EPA's work. The Trump EPA was taking the cop off the beat. This extreme budget proposal was essentially a message from the Trump administration to EPA employees that they should scale back their work. But without these employees, the EPA simply cannot do its job to make sure our communities are protected from illegal pollution. So I just want to send a message to the dedicated career staff at EPA who are watching today and say a very public thank you. Thank you for continuing to protect human health and the environment through the hard work you do each and every day. It's not an easy task with an administration that simply does not share your mission. So let there be no doubt that this committee will continue to hold the Trump administration accountable. And let me say, Madam Chair, in closing, we talk a lot in this place about the Constitution and the separation of powers. Congress enacts the laws and provides the funding. The executive is supposed to enforce the law. That's the separation of powers. It's, you learn this in civics. And I just wish that the Trump administration would follow the Constitution. Don't try to enact the laws and decide where the money goes. Do your job. Enforce the law. That's what the executive branch is supposed to do. Somehow the Trump administration is simply turning that and the Constitution on its head, and it's very unfortunate, but I appreciate the fact, Madam Chair, that we're going to get to the bottom of this enforcement issue and point out the lack of enforcement of this administration. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes for purposes of an opening statement.
Well, good morning, Chair DeGette, and thanks for holding this important hearing today. One of the core missions of the EPA is one that I think we all agree with: for Americans to have clean air, clean land, and clean water. The EPA works toward this worthy goal through a variety of means, including partnerships with state and local governments, grants to states, nonprofits, educational groups, and others, developing and enforcing regulations, studying environmental issues, teaching people, particularly students, about the environment, and through enforcement and compliance. The EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance recently released its fiscal 2018 EPA Enforcement and Compliance annual results, and concerns have been raised regarding a decline in the 2018 numbers. While no one's disputing that some of the numbers from 2018 are lower than in past years, compliance is hard to measure. And you can't simply measure compliance by the number of enforcement actions and the total amounts of fines generated by the EPA each year. You have to have a longer-term look. Therefore, I'd like to put some of these concerns into context. First, there has been a steady decline in the number of federal inspections and evaluations conducted by the EPA since 2012. And there has been a steady decline in the number of civil enforcement initiations and conclusions for the past decade. The decline in these figures is not unique to this administration. In addition, the EPA's FY 2018 results show the EPA's voluntary disclosure program continues to see an increase in the number of facilities that voluntarily disclosed violations. FY 2018 saw a 47% increase in facilities self-disclosing violations over 2017. With 532 entities at over 1,500 facilities voluntarily disclose violations pursuant to EPA's self-disclosure policies. The dramatic increase in self-reports is a good thing, demonstrating that business owners are trying to comply with the complex laws and regulations enforced by the EPA. While there is a downward trend with some of these figures over the course of multiple administrations, some figures fluctuate drastically year to year. For example, the combined civil, judicial, and administrative penalties figure has fluctuated between $69 million and $252 million over the past 3 decades, not accounting for big spikes in years that contain big cases such as Volkswagen and BP. While we are only midway through the fiscal year 2019, we already know the number for this year will be high. EPA has already hit $262 million in combined civil, judicial, and administrative penalties in this fiscal year, Madam Chair. This is due in part to the resolution of the Fiat Chrysler case, which was settled just last month for more than $200 million, including the civil penalties, recall, and mitigation programs. In addition, the average length of time it takes between when a case is initially brought to the EPA and when it is settled can be 2 to 3 years, sometimes more. Solely focusing on a 2-year window to assess overall enforcement and compliance trends simply doesn't make sense. And finally, I think it's critical to today's conversation to note the importance of EPA's partnership and cooperation with the states and regions when it comes to enforcement. Now, while EPA plays a critical role in the process, the majority of inspections and investigations, as well as the day-to-day work, are conducted at the state level. Under the theory of Cooperative Federalism, the states are the ones monitoring most of the enforcement, with the EPA stepping in if there is a failure at the state level or if there's a big and complex case that requires additional resources or expertise. There appears to be a lot of pressure for the EPA to step in and handle cases that aren't necessarily federal cases, but as a society, we don't typically do that with other issues. For example, the local or state authorities would handle most drug-related offenses, and a federal entity such as the FBI would only step in if the case was a larger, complex case or one that crossed state lines. So why should environmental enforcement compliance be any different? So in that vein, I'm encouraged by the work that's been done by the Environmental Council of States and their Cooperative Federalism initiative to improve the working relationship between state environmental agencies and the EPA, including a compliance assurance work group that has been established to find ways to improve the federal-state relationship in the context of compliance assurance. So I think these are important partnerships that should be embraced and improved to ensure that we're working on environmental enforcement and compliance at all levels of government, Madam Chair, to work towards a common goal, a cleaner environment. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to the conversation and hope we can have a holistic way to ensure and measure compliance. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Boudin. I ask unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements be made part of the record. Without objection, they will be entered into the record. I ask unanimous consent that Energy and Commerce members not on the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations be permitted to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I would now like to introduce our first panel witness for today's hearing. Our witness is Ms. Susan Boudin, who's the Assistant Administrator of the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Ms. Boudin, and thank you for appearing in front of our committee. You are aware, I know, that the committee's holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so, has had the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do you have any objections to testifying under oath?
I have no objection to that, and I'm also aware that whether or not you're under oath, it is a crime to lie to Congress.
Thank
Title
you.
18.
Thank you very much. And let the record reflect the witness has responded no. The chair also advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you're entitled to be accompanied by counsel. Do you desire to be accompanied by counsel during your testimony today?
No.
Okay, let the record reflect that the witness has responded no. If you would then, please rise and raise your right hand so you may be sworn in. Please rise. Do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, please raise your hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes. Be seated, please. Let the record reflect that the witness has responded affirmatively, and thank you very much. And as you stated, Ms. Boudin, you're subject to the penalty set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code. And with that, now the chair will recognize Ms. Boudin for a 5-minute summary of their written statement. And in front of you, you can see it. There's a microphone and a series of lights. The light turns yellow when you have a minute left, and it turns red to indicate your time has come to an end. And with that, you're recognized. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the subcommittee. I am Susan Boudin. I'm the Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. Now, you have my written testimony that gives an overview of our enforcement approach, our ongoing work to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of our enforcement and compliance assurance work, and the examples of the good work that EPA's enforcement staff that I'm very proud to share with you. So I want to use my time as an opportunity to begin a dialogue about EPA's enforcement program. Now, some are judging our work based on a narrow set of parameters and then drawing the conclusion that EPA is somehow soft on environmental violators, that EPA doesn't care about compliance with the law. And I'm here to tell you that that is absolutely not true. This narrative, which appeared in the press since the beginning of this administration, discredits the tremendous work of EPA's enforcement and compliance assurance staff. It makes their job more difficult. If a company doubts our resolve, it will take longer to reach a settlement, and it could mean that we have to spend the time and the resources to litigate our claims. I was confirmed as the Assistant Administrator in December of 2017. Beginning in March and throughout the spring of 2018, my headquarters staff and I held video teleconferences with the enforcement staff of each of the regions, and I followed those up with regional visits to each of the 10 regions over the summer, and then we did another round of VTCs in the fall. Now, these interactions are critical because about 1,800 of the OECA FTE, the staff, are in the regions, and that is where most of the enforcement and compliance assurance work takes place. My message to the staff has been consistent on the VTCs, at all hands meetings in the regions, and in email messages. And I want to read to you an excerpt from a message that I sent to all of the EPA enforcement staff in June of 2018. We are committed to the protection of human health and the environment by vigorously enforcing the law. There should be no slowdown in our efforts to correct noncompliance. You have my support and my thanks for those efforts. Our goal is to ensure compliance using all of our enforcement and compliance tools, including formal administrative and judicial enforcement, as well as more informal tools where appropriate. We will not hesitate to deter serious noncompliance using tools up to and including criminal enforcement. We are working to more timely get a return to compliance, and cooperative federalism means that we cooperate with states and we discuss how our combined resources can best address noncompliance. It does not mean that EPA stays out of authorized states. Again, I sent that message to all the staff in June. You can see that I'm pushing back on this these myths about our enforcement program. A strong enforcement program does not mean that we have to collect a particular dollar amount of penalties or take a particular number of formal actions. When I had my confirmation hearing, Senator Inhofe asked me if I was going to impose a quota on enforcement actions. And I assured him that I believe that enforcement is a critical tool, but it's not an end to itself. I don't support enforcement quotas. I do support making sure that the OECA, the enforcement staff, are getting credit for their work, whether or not they take a formal enforcement action, as long as we're achieving compliance with the law. Also at my confirmation hearing, Senator Whitehouse asked me if I would continue to report the categories of annual enforcement results that had been reported by the prior administration, and I assured him that I would. However, I want everyone to understand that these measures do not adequately represent the progress and the results that we are achieving in EPA's Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Program. For example, one of the cases that is cited in my written testimony, Harcross, in that case we addressed compliance with chemical safety regulations at 28 facilities in 18 states. That case counts in our end-of-year results as one case. The staff are spending a lot of time building state capacity as well, for example, with joint inspections. And if we take a joint inspection in an authorized program with the state, it may be that we find violations and the state takes the formal enforcement action and not EPA. We call those state assists, but we're getting compliance. We're also developing new measures to capture those efforts because I want the staff to get credit for all of the work they're doing. And I'm sorry, Madam Chair, but the staff, I have to say this, the staff is not sitting on its hands. They are working very hard. And so, sorry, I'm going to go a tiny bit over. My approach isn't identical to my predecessors. I believe we should focus our enforcement efforts on solving environmental problems, but not targeting specific industries. But I want to assure you that our Enforcement and Compliance Assurance Program continues to play a critical role in protecting human health and the environment. And I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. It is now time for members to ask questions, and the Chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. Ms. Boudin, thank you for your testimony, and I appreciate that you sent a memo to your staff saying that we're going to robustly enforce the laws. But I want to ask you about some of these statistics, and most of them are about statistics. And I know the EPA staff are working hard, but I also know that their numbers have been depleted, and I think we've got some questions about that today. And I also know that you are upset about some of this press, but the press that I'm looking at is talking about some of the numbers at the EPA, and that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. Now, injunctive relief represents the estimated cost of actions taken by a defendant to come into compliance with the law, so they're no longer in violation. Is that generally correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, the EPA recently announced that in fiscal year 2018, adjusted for inflation, the estimated dollar value of the injunctive relief was $3.95 billion. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
I believe that's correct.
Now, I looked at a report that was done by the Christian Science Monitor. I mentioned this in my opening statement, which says that the average annual cost of injunctive relief is $7.74 billion, and the EPA's fiscal year 2018 figure was the lowest it had been in 15 years. Are you aware of this report, Ms. Boudin?
I read the Christian Science Monitor.
Okay, so you're aware of it.
I read the article, but
Okay.
Well,
okay, so
I'll
you know
answer
the
it.
report.
Yes.
Now, I also understand the inspections, which are key to EPA's enforcement efforts, are the lowest they've been in a decade. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, okay, the inspections are the lowest. So moving on, another measurement of enforcement activity is civil penalties, which are monetary assessments paid by a regulated entity because of a violation. Is that generally a good description of the monetary penalties?
I wouldn't say that it was a good measure of enforcement results, and I would say
Okay.
they go up and down.
But here's what I asked you. Monetary assessments are paid by a regulated entity because of a violation.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, EPA's enforcement and compliance annual results for fiscal year 2018 indicate that the EPA obtained $69.47 million in administrative and civil judicial penalties. Is that correct?
I believe that's right.
And according to a February 8th Washington Post report, the $69 million in civil penalties represents the lowest in nearly a quarter century. Is that factually accurate?
I believe that it is.
Okay. Now, in your testimony, you say the state of California and the EPA secured a civil, and I think Mr. Walden mentioned this too, secured a civil penalty of $305 million for Clean Air Act violations against Fiat Chrysler. Is that right?
Yes,
Now, that case was initiated during the Obama administration. Is that correct?
there was a notice of violation, I believe it was in January of 2017.
But it was
Notice.
initiated under the Obama administration.
So a notice of violation is not a formal enforcement action.
Okay. Now, so I didn't ask you about a formal enforcement action. The investigation was initiated during the Obama
The
administration.
investigation was, yes.
Thank you. Now, while I appreciate the EPA has brought the important case to a resolution, I continue to be worried that that the 2019 numbers will reflect I wonder if they'll reflect civil penalties against a large variety of polluters. In other words, that we won't just have one penalty in this year. So let me ask you, the Christian Science Monitor reports that for fiscal year 2018, the number of civil cases initiated by the agency was the lowest since 1982. Is that correct?
I have no reason to believe it isn't. So
Okay.
I'm not
And
entirely
also the number of cases referred to the Department of Justice were the lowest since 1976. Is that correct?
I don't have that number.
Okay. Now, do you have any reason to doubt that number? Or do you just not know it?
I would have to, I could respond for the record.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
So it's just that you don't know the number?
Right.
Okay. Now, last year, the Trump administration proposed cutting the EPA's budget by almost 25%. Congress didn't go along with it, but I'm wondering about what message this sends to the employees. Is it true that your office has lost nearly 17% of its workforce?
No, that's not true.
It's not. What's the status of the workforce at this point?
So I'm talking about the headquarters staff, the OECA staff. Our ceiling is in 18 and hopefully in 19 as well, is 649. We currently have 607 people on board. I think about 9 more coming on board in March.
Okay.
I have authorized hiring to bring it up to the ceiling.
Okay. I'm sure some others will follow up, and my time's expired, but I really want to thank you for answering my questions. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the recognition. Thank you for being here, Ms. Boudin. Each year, OECA reports 12 different metrics to provide a high level of overview of the agency's enforcement and compliance results for that year, including estimated environmental benefits, criminal and civil enforcement accomplishments, and Superfund accomplishments. In your opinion, can we look at just one of these metrics to determine the strength of EPA's enforcement and compliance program for any given year?
No, that these results, which I've certainly assured Senator Whitehouse I would continue to report, do not accurately reflect the great work that the staff is doing.
So what are some of the limitations of the metrics that EPA reports on each year to demonstrate EPA's enforcement and compliance annual results? What are the shortcomings of the?
So what we report in our formal database are only formal actions. And so it doesn't reflect the work that we've done cooperating with states. For example, when we go out and we do joint inspections, and we do that often because we are trying to help build state capacity. It doesn't reflect some of the work that we've done, even in sophisticated states and cities. For example, in Pittsburgh, we did the assessment of the drinking water program. We're collaborating right now with state of New Jersey, looking at, I think it's Newark and their pipes, their lead pipes. So we do a lot of work that is not captured in these formal annual results.
Okay. So turning to combined civil, judicial, and administrative penalties figure, last year's number came in at $69 million. According to the fiscal year 2018 results, what is the current number for fiscal year 2019, understanding that we're only midway through the year?
I know you quoted it, or maybe Chairman or Ranking Member Walden quoted it. I don't have the exact number. I do know that, our Fiat Chrysler case, which we lodged, it has not yet been entered. We had, with California, over $305 million. We've been collecting other penalties, but yes, that number is going to be much higher in 2019. And may I also say that if you look at it again as trends, out of the past 11 years, 8 of the past 11 years, the annual penalties were less than $250 million in 8 of the 11 years. So you can't look at averages when you're looking at and suggest that represents a trend. We did have 3 years with penalties over $1 billion, and so again, that makes averages completely invalid from a statistical standpoint.
Okay. So if we look at the over 300 million that you quoted, that's including California's enforcement, is what you were saying?
Yes.
So we already know that this year will be at least the 4th highest year for combined civil, judicial, and administrative penalties dating back to 1989. So in addition to formal enforcement actions, EPA engages in, and you mentioned, other activities to promote compliance, such as state assists.
Right.
Can you describe some of the activities that EPA does to promote compliance with the environmental laws and regulations that are not accounted for in these annual metrics?
Sure. So one of the things that we're trying to do is encourage companies to get back into compliance quickly. So we revised our inspector guidance so that the inspectors would actually point out to the facilities what the problems were so they could fix them right away. We're also we've also told the staff that they need to get the inspection reports back to the facilities so they can fix their noncompliance, and try and do that within 70 days. We are continuing to have our compliance assurance centers up and running, and we also have tools, electronic tools that can help. For example, we have in the Clean Water Act area for the permit holders, they have to report electronically, and we can set up our electronic system, and we have, to automatically give them a notice if they have failed to submit a report. And we're also developing a new tool where they can automatically get a notice if their discharge is above the permitted level. So we're building all these tools in to try and get compliance back more effectively, more efficiently, more quickly.
Okay, thank you. The fiscal year 2018 enforcement compliance results recently released by EPA show that the number of environmental crime cases opened and the number of civil enforcement cases initiations have been gradually declining over the past 10 years. Can you explain why there has been a gradual decline in the number of civil and criminal cases opened each year?
So I don't have a good explanation for that. I do know that that there had been a decline in the new cases that we opened on the criminal side over 11 years, and that we are now increasing. They are now increasing that again, which is wonderful.
Is it just better compliance by people in the industries?
It's very hard to measure compliance, and so we don't have a good measure of compliance. But it is true that we are doing a much better job in targeting noncompliance. So that goes to the inspection issue. So we don't need to take a lot of inspections to find we can figure out where to expect noncompliance and target accordingly.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired. I appreciate your answers. Now yield back.
Chair now recognizes the full committee chairman, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I wanted to follow up on kind of where you left off. Ms. Boudin, on the campaign trail, President Trump said he wanted to dramatically cut the EPA and leave only, I quote, little tidbits left. Last year, the Trump administration's budget proposal seemed to try to make good on that threat by proposing a nearly 25% cut to the agency. Now, of course, Congress didn't go along with that, but that's what he threatened, or that's what he suggested. And then in September, we had a Washington Post story that noted that during the first 18 months of the Trump administration, nearly 1,600 workers left the EPA, while only 400 were hired. And of course, just a few weeks ago, your staff informed our committee that your office has lost in excess of 130 enforcement staff since January of 2017. Now, I know you said that you've authorized to bring it back, but how are you going to go about that? I mean, do you intend to replace the roughly 130 staff? And, what's your timetable? How are you going to do that? Well, I guess I'm kind of wondering if it's really going to happen. So tell us how it's going to happen and when.
So I can only hire up to the FTE ceiling that Congress has provided. And that, again, I believe in the 19, we had the 18 bill where we had a ceiling of the 649, I believe.
But let me
our
just
19
interrupt you
ceilings
because of lack of time. I know you've said you intend to do this. What I'd like to know is what the timetable is to actually accomplish the goal of reaching this authorized amount.
So our personnel processes are working as quickly as possible. They, when I say I authorize, that means the human resources process is underway. That's what,
But how
that's what
long is
that
it going
means.
to take? What's your timetable?
Can I get back to you on that? Because we are trying, as an agency, we're trying to speed up that timetable. And so may I get back to you that for the record?
Yeah,
about what
but
our
give me
efforts
like a
are?
timetable so when this is
Well,
going
the
to
one
happen.
I'm most familiar with is actually bringing on the criminal investigators, which takes a very
Yeah,
long
you
time
can-
because
you
of the background
can,
checks.
with the chair's permission, you can provide us in writing, but
Okay.
we'd like some details.
Okay.
Now, I also wanted to talk about the EPA's regional enforcement workforce because, of course, you have 10 regional offices across the country, and, a substantial amount of the enforcement work occurs at that regional level. How many regional enforcement staff have left the agency since January 2017, and how many have been hired?
I don't have that number. I'd have to provide it for the record.
All right,
I do
so-
know the regions are hiring in the enforcement space as well.
Well, this is just as important, right?
Right.
If you could get back to us, I guess, with the permission of the chair, and tell us how many you've lost, how many you've hired, and if you intend to make up that difference by replacing them, what the timetable is for that
Within
as
the
well.
congressionally authorized FTE ceiling.
Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you is I made a statement during my opening. I said that it appears that the Trump EPA is relying on industry to voluntarily come forward and disclose when they're not in compliance. So what is your response to that? Would you agree that you do have an effort to have them voluntarily come forward, and how do you go about that?
So EPA's had a self-audit policy in place since 2000. In 2008, we expanded that with a new owner audit policy, and we are now we've developed another oil and gas new owner policy that's more tailored to that industry. It was based on a 2016 matter that was done in the previous administration with a new owner of oil and gas.
Why should I believe that the worst offenders would voluntarily come forward? How is that? I mean, human nature is such that bad actors don't voluntarily say they're bad. So how is that going to work? How does that work?
So I would not suggest that the audit policy is appropriate for the worst offenders. And I would also completely agree that you can't rely on self-disclosure alone, that you need an enforcement program to create
All right,
the
but how is this
incentive.
of any value? I mean, you're sort of saying it's been in place for years. Does it work? Do people voluntarily come forward?
Yeah, yes, entities voluntarily come forward, self-disclose, and then certify not that they've returned to compliance.
What's their incentive to do that?
Well, may I give you an example?
Sure.
So if you're, we absolutely do need to still keep inspecting and keep enforcement to create the very incentive. And if you voluntarily disclose and you don't come in to compliance or you don't have full compliance, then there's no shield to enforcement. We had a situation where a company and they self-disclosed under a state audit program. They didn't catch all their violations. And EPA, we came in after and did an administrative enforcement action for the violations they did not self-disclose. There was no shield from that state self-disclosure. I mean, they didn't know they were out of compliance, but it didn't matter. We came back for the ones they did not self-disclose. But we came in, followed on, and did take an enforcement action for the actions that they didn't disclose.
I don't see how that's helpful, but whatever. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And to our witness, thank you for being here today and the work you and your team do around the country day in and day out to protect American consumers. Just for the record, I know in my testimony I said in FY18, We saw a 47% increase in facilities self-disclosing violations over 2017, 532 entities at 1,500 facilities. So to follow up on what Mr. Pallone said, from your perspective, why do companies come forward?
They come forward because if they self-disclose before we find it, so we haven't done the inspection, we haven't taken an action, then they will get relief on penalties.
Okay.
So we won't,
So it's a carrot and stick approach.
absolutely,
And then if you do come in and find things they haven't disclosed, you've still got the stick.
absolutely.
And you are using it. Is
Yes.
that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay, well, that makes sense. And I know, and it seems to me, I may be off, but I think in the workforce or workplace safety too, like OSHA rules in Oregon, we had something similar to that, where you could kind of disclose, bring them in, they would do a review, and then you could comply and kind of not be in penalty. Because most employers want to do the right thing.
Yeah, I'll have to take your word for that.
Yeah, no, I understand. But there are some that don't, and those are the ones we want you to go after. I think we can all agree the ultimate goal is to safeguard human health and protect the environment, and compliance with EPA's environmental laws is necessary to achieve that. So what is OECA doing under your leadership to meet these goals, and what changes, if any, have you made to EPA's enforcement or compliance priorities in order to do this?
Thank you for that question. So we are looking at our priorities because, as everyone I think here recognizes, the vast majority of the enforcement and inspections happen in the states, and so we have very highly skilled staff, and we have very good technical resources. So we want to be able to target our resources where we'll have the most impact. So we have looked at what we call the national compliance initiatives, and have looked at where should we be focusing our resources. And right now, that is out for public comment. We had a Federal Register notice asking for the public to comment on where our priorities should be. And what that notice says is that we want to make sure that we're focusing on problems, the environmental problems. So whether it's trying to decrease the number of water segments that don't meet water quality standards, whether it's trying to decrease the number of non-attainment areas in Clean Air Act, as well as trying to focus on vulnerable populations around the country. And so we have initiatives already that, for example, for air toxics, we have initiatives like flaring that gets at issues like VOCs. We're asking about the public and states whether we should expand our initiatives to include a children's exposure to lead initiative, and we're asking about starting a drinking water initiative so we can work with states. And again, what we want to do is focus on these environmental problems.
All right. And then I've certainly seen a change the last couple of years when it came to the Superfund site cleanup, especially in the Portland Harbor Superfund case. Been dragging on for years and years and years. And this administration stepped in and said, why don't we get about moving forward and actually cleaning it up? And this is in Portland, not a known Trump red territory. And they were ecstatic that this administration and this EPA was ready to help clear out the regulatory hurdles or whatever was there that was unnecessary and move forward. Can you talk a little bit about how you help encourage contaminated site redevelopment and some of these issues?
Yeah, first on Portland, yes, I think everybody is in agreement that needs to move forward. We need to get that, that cleanup moving. And on redevelopment, yes, we are. We recognize that contaminated properties blight a community, and that there are opportunities to bring back to the community with redevelopment. And so we are using our enforcement tools to help that, and that includes entering into agreements with what we call bona fide prospective purchasers, people who aren't liable. So we can give them comfort, we can give them protection if they're going to come in and do a redevelopment. And we've had some great examples of that around the country. There was one out in Region 5 where McLeod Steel, they're coming in. It's been a blight on the community for years, and they're going to come in and tear down buildings that have been decrepit, again, to get rid of an eyesore and allow for redevelopment. So the shift is that we're willing to enter into these agreements.
All right. And I know this committee did great work in the last Congress approving a modernization of the Brownfields law.
Yes.
Bipartisan, I think it was unanimous out of Energy and Commerce and signed
That's
by
great.
President Trump. And so we want to be your partner in helping clean up these sites.
Yeah, the Build
all
Act.
levels.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Welcome. Ms. Boudin, I'd like to better understand what EPA is doing to make sure changes in the enforcement program do not disproportionately harm low-income communities and communities of color. History shows us time and time again the federal action and leadership are necessary to prevent environmental injustice. Ms. Boudin, would you agree that EPA needs to ensure equitable treatment and impact for communities of color and low-income communities when the agency enforces federal environmental laws and policies?
Yes, absolutely.
Last year, EPA's own scientists released a report in the American Journal of Public Health, April of 2018, confirming what many underserved rural and minority communities already knew, that low income and people of color are disproportionately affected by air pollution. These findings joined an extensive body of research which have found that both polluters and pollution are disproportionately located in low income and minority communities. Would you agree that these findings make it all the more important to the health and safety of these communities that EPA effectively enforce against those polluters who break the law and illegally pollute?
So I absolutely agree with the statement. I haven't read the article, but I agree with the statement you just made.
Thank you. Ms. Boudin, on our second panel, we will hear from both Dr. Nelson and Mr. Shaffer, who both raise important issues about the critical need for robust EPA enforcement in protecting minority and poor resource communities who are often disproportionately close to polluting facilities. For those communities that live in close proximity to industrial sites that pose health risks, can you assure them that you will use all of EPA's enforcement tools to protect them?
We've made it a priority to address air toxics, which in talking about our national compliance initiatives, focusing on vulnerable populations. We also have as one of our priorities compliance with chemical safety regulations, and again, often you can have chemicals being used in.
What do you define as vulnerable populations?
So there are both low-income and minority communities, I believe.
Because
with
of the
research
environmental
and
injustices.
cumulative effects and location.
Okay. And due to resource, legal, or political constraints, some states may lack the will or ability to provide strong environmental protection. So can you please explain to me what extra enforcement measures EPA takes to ensure such communities are adequately protected if a state is not up to the task?
So in the guidance that we've set out to the regions on interacting with states, we have been very clear that if it's an authorized program, we're going to look to the state to take action, but if the state doesn't have the capability or the will to take action, and we know there's a violation, then we absolutely should be stepping in to make sure that we're getting compliant.
Oftentimes, communities that are resource poor, that lack social capital, do not have the capacity, the know-how, or wherewithal to file complaints and to seek the EPA's assistance in mitigating or preventing some potential environmental injustice. What does the EPA do to provide those technical assistance to those low-income, rural, or minority communities?
So my program doesn't have technical assistance grants. The Superfund program does, but we don't have those kinds of community grants.
So currently so Superfunds do, if they want to
Right.
apply for a Superfund.
And there are environmental justice grants that are run by the Environmental Justice Program, but so we don't have enforcement grants to communities of the type that you're describing. But we do have our
So oftentimes
initiatives.
it's the communities that inform you of those violations.
Yes, and we definitely pay very close attention. We have a tips and complaint line, and we follow
So
up.
there should be probably some outreach to them and capacity training. It's a tragedy and true injustice that in America today, the quality of your air and water and the potential exposure to hazardous and toxic substances is determined to a significant extent by your income, your zip code, and your race. So EPA can and should be doing more to protect disenfranchised communities. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I would agree that's why we should be focusing on environmental problems when we say what should be our priorities, where should we direct the federal resources.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Madam Chairman. interesting tone to this discussion so far, and it just, I hope for the audience and those listening in that this is obviously, some of the first steps of the election campaign of 2020. I was interested in the metrics that were being used as a measure of success of what your agency has done, and it seems to be, someone wants to say that you're successful if you have more inspections and more fines. That seems to be the only measure that's in this room that's being used to find out whether you're successful, regardless of the outcome of what's happening. And I was looking for some analogies, thinking some analogies. I sat here listening to this line of rationale, and I think of, even though it's not yours under EPA, but under maybe OSHA, is the number of coal mines that have been shut down all across America. As a result of the fact there aren't coal mines, there aren't inspections. If we were to use that metric, it would mean that maybe OSHA is not doing its job because they're not doing as many inspections as they've done the previous years, or there aren't fines. Well, there aren't the coal mines. And the same thing is appropriate for our coal-fired generating plants. We've had some 300 coal-fired generating plants shut down over the last 10 years. Therefore, you're going to have fewer inspections. You're going to have fewer fines as a result of that. But that's what people seem to be on the other side of the aisle are saying. That's the way we should be measuring this, is how many fines and inspections. But at the same time, we talk about voluntary compliance and think, look what's happened since we didn't sign the Kyoto Treaty. We didn't do the Paris Accord. We've withdrawn from that. But yet, their emissions have dropped. We look at the SOx and NOx gases that you all were very, very much active in pursuing through the EPA. The SOx gases have dropped since 1990, 92%. NOx gases, 84% down. Just in the last 10 years, the CO2 emissions have dropped by 20-some percent. But that's not, maybe it doesn't have as many fines and inspections, but the result is we're accomplishing a cleaner environment doing it this way. So having said all that, looking about compliance, voluntary compliance and self-auditing, you mentioned in your report, that your written report, that you had talked about Mark West providing, they're using some innovative technology.
Right.
To reduce their methane emissions and other volatile organic compounds. And they're sharing that information with other people, other institutions, because we know methane is far worse than CO2 in what it does to the atmosphere. So can you elaborate a little bit about how we might improve on that, or the role that technology might play in this?
Yeah, some of what you're getting to, Congressman, is kind of the force amplifier of some of our settlements, and Mark West is a great example because, they have gas pipelines. You have a pigging operation. They didn't know that they had releases, but they did, and they developed new technology. And as part of their settlement, they have made it available to everyone in the industry with no license cost whatsoever. So not only do we get the reductions from that company, but also from other companies. Another example, Amazon. They were selling unregistered pesticides on their website, and in violation of FIFRA. And as part of that settlement, they agreed to do training. They agreed to do, a lot of monitoring certification. And so not only, is Amazon in compliance, but it's a supply chain issue. Everyone in their supply chain would be in compliance. So again, you can't capture that, but it's a force multiplier of some of the work we do.
So let me just close in the 30-some seconds. Do you think it's more effective to look at the outcome, the results, that we've had CO2 drop, SOx and NOx gases drop, or do you think the measure should be what they're talking about is the number of fines and the number of inspections? Which is the more effective metric?
Certainly the outcome.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer for 5 minutes. We have Castor and Custer. Ms. Custer, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us. I just want to take exception to my colleague, Mr. McKinley, suggesting that this is politically motivated. The health and well-being of my constituents is not politically motivated, and I think we can find common ground. But in New Hampshire, we've been dealing with a St. Gobain site in Litchfield that's in my district, which was pollution by PFAS, the per and polyfluorinated compounds. And fortunately, we have had a settlement, but we had to spend millions of dollars to connect $2.4 million as well as $900,000 in loans and $600,000 in grants to connect these households to safe drinking water because their wells were contaminated. It's not political. The wells didn't distinguish between R's and D's. These are my constituents, and I'm trying to keep them safe. And my question for you, I've been disappointed by the EPA's PFAS action plan that was published last week because it doesn't seem to actually include much action. For instance, while EPA officials said that they intend to move forward to maximum contaminant levels for 2 PFAS chemicals, there was no commitment in the plan to initiating this regulatory process. And that means other communities are going to be left to rely on health advisories that may or may not keep my colleagues' constituents safe. What can your office do to help communities that are being poisoned by PFAS in the air, water, and soil? And I know you are putting a great deal of reliance on voluntary disclosure, but what makes you think that companies are going to voluntarily take on this responsibility when, in fact, that was not the case for us? They had to be caught in the act through testing and through local community efforts before the company came to the table to negotiate a settlement.
Thank you. First, on the PFAS action plan that the administrator announced, maybe it was a little over a week ago, he very clearly makes a commitment to initiate the regulatory process.
And what's the
establish,
timeline for
you know,
that?
That I don't know, but I'd have to take that back because that's not.
Because there's
my
urgency to this. This PFAS is showing up in water, groundwater, all across this country.
And can you tell me the name again of the site that you're talking about? 'Cause
It's
I'm familiar with
Litchfield, New
Air Force
Hampshire,
Base, but I'm not.
St. Gobain's.
Oh, okay.
They used to make Teflon in pans, and it's gone into the water.
Okay.
And we have hundreds of families. They were on bottled water for a long period of time, and now to the expense of millions of dollars, we've had to connect them to safe drinking water.
So one of the things that actually my office is involved in is developing a map, a GIS map, where we would identify on the map all of the locations where we might expect PFAS contamination to be. Because remember, when they did the unregulated contaminant monitoring for PFAS that ended that was part of the 2015 round of monitoring, they found it above the health advisory in 1.3% of the public water systems and found it at any detection level in about 4%. But that doesn't capture communities with under 10,000 hookups. So we want the map so you can go and look, has there been a firefighting center there? Is there an industry where they've been using the PFAS? So again, for the very purpose that you talked about, which is targeting so people can go then and do the testing.
Well, let me ask you, is there any enforceable requirement to report a PFAS release? They know, the companies that use this technology, use these chemicals, know. I mean, they're well aware of the plume right under their facilities and their sites. In the end, St. Gobain's did come to the table, and we were able to negotiate. But why don't you rely on them? Why do you do this whole mapping and not just have a requirement, an enforceable requirement that the company has to come forward?
That is another action that's in the PFAS action plan, which is to add PFOA and PFOS, and again, this is another office that would do this. It's a regulatory action, but add it to the toxics release inventory, which then would mandate the reporting of release.
And what's the timeline for that?
Again, I'd have to answer for the record because it's not my office.
Well, I just want to put on the record the
Right.
urgency of families that are being exposed, and I want to thank the Moms Clean Air Action for being with us today, and for families all across this country who care about their children and the quality. These are families that are drinking the water, and it's not just Flint, Michigan. It's my district, it's every district across this country, and I urge you to bring some urgency to this, and with that, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. After reading through some of the testimony, I believe that we may hear some claims this morning in our next panel about the News Source Review program. And I've been through this with the committee before, but there's lots of stories like the ones out of my district where people are not pursuing improvements because they're afraid of tripping over the News Source Review program and then having to spend a whole lot more money, so they don't do anything. And that's caused a lot of, I think, a lot of upgrades not to be done, and some of which would have improved the environment. Now, we know the Americans are paying more than necessary because of this and other things to improve air quality due to the overlapping air programs. About 13 programs overlap with the NSR, News Source Review, and I have legislation to fix all that, but it's not likely to come up in the next couple of years, even though I think it's great. Common sense reforms that will benefit the environment. Ms. Boudin, would you like to speak to the NSR program? Because you all are doing some things administratively similar to what my bill would do. And just tell us what you're doing on that and how that relates to other programs that you all are working on.
So thank you, Congressman. The NSR program is run out of the Air Office, and so they would establish the policies and the regulations. We obviously enforce. But I do want to mention that we have there for a number of years there has been a national compliance initiative that deals with News Source Review. That under that as a result, and today, and I think that's already been mentioned perhaps by Congressman McKinley, that sulfur dioxide is down 90% in the power sector. Nitrogen oxide is down by 85% in the power sector since 1997. And so when we look at where we should be focusing and where we have the opportunity to help communities and to get help non-compliance, we're looking at other areas. And I would like to mention the fact that we're doing a lot of work on mobile sources now. Obviously that was the VW case, it was the Fiat Chrysler case, but we also are dealing with it in terms of defeat devices and the aftermarket and the catalytic converters. I know that we got a letter from Congressman Guthrie, Congressman Kinley, and two of your colleagues about the catalytic converters, and we are changing our tampering policy. We expect to roll that out pretty shortly. And the estimate that I've been given is that the state of California expects that by changing our policy and encouraging more better performing catalytic converters, we can get as ready as 85,000 tons per year of NOx nationwide, again, which is going to help with ozone non-attainment. It's NOx. It could help with the deposition of nitrogen.
And that wouldn't necessarily show up in these stats that have been thrown around this morning, because
it would not.
You're dealing with sometimes individuals who are doing things they're not supposed to do, as opposed to companies.
You're right. Changing our tampering policy will not show up, and to get these kinds of reductions will not show up in our results.
And you've been working with the states a lot to make sure that they do, because the states do a lot of the enforcement, isn't that correct?
Yes, that's true.
And isn't your goal to move this to the states? Can you give us some idea of how you've been doing things with the states and what inefficient duplications you've seen with the state programs?
So a couple of the members here mentioned the ECOS working group. So we did hear at the very beginning when
For the folks back home, that would be the Environmental Council of the States.
Thank you. I apologize for that.
That's all right.
And who represent the state commissioners, and they were complaining that EPA would show up in their state without even telling them, taking either an inspection or enforcement action without even telling them, and it could, even at a facility the state perhaps had just inspected. And so what we've said to the regions is, look, you need to be working in partnership with states. You need to do work planning together. Everyone has finite resources. You need to divide up the universe. We absolutely need a compliance assurance presence. We need inspections, but we should be working collaboratively so that if the state is doing it, we don't need to be doing it because that would be wasteful.
Right.
If the state needs to get training and capacity building, then we should be going out with them and providing that training.
And you all are obviously monitoring what the states are doing so that you can make sure that somebody's covering it. Isn't that correct? Yes or no? I'm running out of time.
Yes.
Or no? All right. And since you've been there, have you all intervened in any states where they aren't doing what they're supposed to do and haven't done the inspections properly or something?
So we have two examples where we've leaned heavily on states to take action, and they have. So yes, we do have examples of that. But then at the end of the day, the state finally did take the action, and we didn't have to. And all that work doesn't show up in our results either.
In your data. Okay, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ms. Boudin, I'd like to spend the next few minutes talking to you about EPA civil case initiations. Civil enforcement at EPA is a tool that you use to hold polluters accountable for violating federal environmental laws and to deter future bad actors. Where EPA identifies a significant violation and determines that federal enforcement is appropriate, the agency may start an enforcement case. Is that generally correct?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Boudin, EPA's fiscal year 2018 enforcement and compliance numbers, according to your own numbers, indicate that the civil case initiations last year were at their lowest point in a decade, just over 1,800. To add to that, a watchdog group recently reported that civil enforcement case initiations last year were lower than any year going back to 1982. That would mean civil case initiations may be at the lowest level in 36 years. What is your explanation for that? That we're at the EPA is at its lowest level of civil case initiations in 36 years?
So, Congresswoman Castor, as I had pointed out earlier, that is a narrow slice of the work that we do. It is federal, formal enforcement case initiations. And so it doesn't capture the work that we're doing with states, where we may develop a case and they may take it over. It doesn't capture the facilities that are getting back into compliance after self-disclosing. So it's important, and I would absolutely agree that we need to maintain enforcement presence, but I would not say that the number of cases is reflective of that. And
no, your predecessor did not agree. Cynthia Giles, who preceded you as head of EPA's enforcement office, was very recently quoted in a press report saying, EPA is trying to convince media and the public that EPA is still doing its job on enforcement, despite all of the reports showing that it isn't the case. So I think it's fairly clear EPA is not doing the job that it should. And so taking your predecessor's point as it relates to case initiations, how can you claim that the public, how can you claim that the EPA is in fact going after polluters, giving the decline? You said it's a narrow piece, but wow, 36 years, a 10-year decline that took a hit as the Trump administration came into the executive branch. I'm having a hard time seeing how you claim otherwise.
So I'm sorry that you feel that way. I know that the staff are working very hard in developing cases and bringing cases, and that we are trying to target our resources and our, where we have.
Here's why it's important, because lax enforcement sends the wrong message to industry and polluters. And I have a very hard time understanding how the public and the regulated community are supposed to have confidence in EPA when you're not enforcing America's bedrock environmental laws, when they see that an agency is initiated the lowest amount of cases in what appears to be 3 decades. And did I understand your answer? Did you testify in a previous answer that we have EPA is initiating a fewer number of enforcement cases because there are fewer bad actors?
I didn't say that.
Okay. Chairwoman DeGette, I'm very concerned about this. They're not going to be able to deter bad actors. These are extraordinarily low numbers. It really appears to me that the Trump administration and EPA, which is supposed to be the guardian of the public health, is elevating polluter profits over the public health. This is at a time when they're also rolling back critically important environmental and public health protections. What you do here by not enforcing the law is you further compound the problem. And it's an abdication of your responsibility.
Will the
to American
gentlelady
people.
yield?
I yield.
Ms. Boudin, so you had said to Ms. Castor that the number of enforcement actions filed at the federal level is just a narrow slice. Do you know how many additional cases were filed at the state level then with EPA assistance? Did that number go up dramatically in the last 2 years?
So we haven't started formally tracking state assists. We've asked the regions to track their state assists. So I have some data on that, which I can give to you for the record, but it wasn't tracked before.
So you
What
don't-
we're calling state assists.
Right, so you don't really know if the number of state cases went up. You're just suspecting it might have.
The states report some of their cases to us in our reporting system, and we can provide you with that data. I don't have all of their data.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
And Ms. Castor, thank you for letting me use the rest of your time, which has expired. I'm now going to recognize Mr. Duncan from South Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my state, in one of my communities, has a 4-lane highway running through it. It's not an interstate highway, but they were requesting an interchange, off-ramps, create a new industrial area. And the county was under a non-attainment order from EPA. Very little industry in that county in upstate South Carolina that has emissions issues, very little. And very little traffic. It's not an interstate highway on this 4-lane. But yet they were denied the ability to put in that interchange. And when we started looking at it, the EPA under the Obama administration had monitors in the county for air quality. And it was very apparent that the emissions or what was affecting this county was coming from not another county, but another state. Tennessee, primarily. Westerly winds coming over the mountains, settling in Pickens County, South Carolina. So there's an issue where we put these monitors for a lot of different things, whether it's heat sensors or whether it's air quality sensors. Those are issues that may affect other members' communities, and just wanted to raise awareness of that. I want to jump to a particular type of case, those being the Clean Air Act non-attainment cases. The oil and gas new owner audit program is one interesting approach that the EPA is taking to reduce non-attainment. Can you tell us more about this program and other actions EPA has taken to reduce the Clean Air Act non-attainment?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we, in the oil and gas sector, you can have leaks from tanks. There can be leaks from wells. The new owner self-disclosure program encourages a new owner of these facilities to do their own inspection and discover their own violations and then disclose them, come into compliance, and then they would have no penalties because they're the new owner. They weren't responsible for it. And we've seen a lot of companies come in under our new owner program because of that incentive. They're starting fresh. And it's been very valuable. Again, it was, for the oil and gas sector, it started from a settlement that was begun in 2016, but then recognized that could be a model that could be used, more broadly. And so it is a great opportunity to, again, get compliance and let the new owner start fresh.
I would say that's a cost savings for the EPA and ultimately the taxpayer.
Yes.
To follow up, there's been some criticism on the reduction of the size of the OECA office. I've been supportive of this administration's effort to peel back some of the layers of bureaucracy that have been embedded themselves in the agency. When the EPA is inefficient, they are holding up capital. How does this new owner audit program capitalize on the resources of the EPA while still reducing non-attainment?
Well, if the new owner is coming in, then you're right. We don't have to expend our resources then going out and finding them. We don't have to expend our resources bringing a case against them. Again, it is far more efficient and gets compliance more quickly.
You can focus those resources on other areas
on
that
vulnerable populations, on chemical risk safety issues, our other national compliance initiatives.
Right. Yeah, thanks for being here. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Boudin, for being here. I just want to go back on exchange you had a moment ago, because you seemed to suggest that the reduction in civil penalties and other things that, from an enforcement standpoint at the federal level, has maybe been replaced by states being more aggressive on that front. Did you say something to that effect?
I said that we work, that most of the activities are taking place at the state level, and that's always been true.
Yeah.
And that we're working with states, and states are more sophisticated, and we're building state capacity if they've lost folks. And
are you aware that the state fines have also diminished over the last couple of years? When you look at the record, yeah. It shows that between 2006 and 2016, the penalties at the state level were averaging about $91 million a year, but in 2017 they were $38 million, and 2018 they were $59 million. A lot of these state agencies are not resourced in a way that can make up for lack of enforcement at the federal level, so it seems to be diminishing on both fronts.
I think I've said in response to other questions, but I don't believe penalties are a good measure of enforcement. Penalties are important for deterrence, but it is not a measure of compliance. And you'll see in the data that we presented, because we go back 10 years, that penalties go up and down dramatically. And in fact, at the federal level, they were below $250 million for 8 out of the last 10 years.
Well, it seems, many if not all of the indicators which we have at our disposal to judge whether enforcement is happening at the levels it should or not seem to be going in the wrong direction, whether you look at the state efforts or you look at the federal efforts. To me, that would suggest that the federal government needs to step up even more and occupy this space in an aggressive and responsible way. But let me talk to you about injunctive relief, because that is an important tool that you have as part of your enforcement kit of measures that you can undertake. And this is a way that the EPA can insist on industry players and others coming into compliance. So we understand from your staff briefing recently that EPA enforcement actions resulted in almost $3.95 billion in compliance costs in fiscal year 2018. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I'll
okay,
read it
you
off
got
the
it
chart
right there.
here.
All right, and according to a January 24th Washington Post article, the compliance costs for the 2 decades before the Trump administration roughly averaged $7.8 billion per year, which is nearly double the amount that the EPA obtained in FY 2018. Are those numbers correct as far as you know?
I don't believe that you can average these numbers. I mean, you have the chart also. You can see that you have very, very.
Well, in any event, they were
So
significantly higher. And then in a recent article, I just wanted to note in the Christian Science Monitor, your predecessor, Cynthia Giles, was quoted as saying, "Injunctive relief tells you whether EPA is taking on the tough, very hard, big pollution cases," and the data shows that the Trump EPA is not doing that. Now, I get that that the compliance injunctive relief numbers can vary from year to year, but these are pretty low numbers, some of the lowest we've seen in a long time. Is Ms. Giles wrong when she says injunctive relief is a good indicator to evaluate whether an administration is going after the worst polluters, in your view?
I think that former Assistant Administrator Giles knows very well that it takes, when you're talking about these really big cases, it takes a lot of years to develop and complete those cases.
Well, let me grab onto that because I'm going to run out of time, that idea of it taking a long time, because that $3.95 billion figure for 2018 Apparently, according to Christian Science Monitor article, 40% of that total almost is from cases that were settled by the EPA under President Obama. So even that low number, that $3.95 billion low number, if you look at it in terms of what's actually been undertaken in this administration, it's much lower still, because 40% of that is coming from the prior administration. Are you aware of those numbers? Can you tell me what the number is that comes from the previous administration?
So we, in our results, we count the injunctive relief in the year that the court enters it, and as well that you're not going to see numbers from cases that we initiated or that would be big. Small cases, yes, but large cases, because it takes a long time. So you're going to see that later. So we are, yes.
I get it.
working
There's
on
a
cases.
timing issue. There's a
Yes.
snapshot issue.
Yeah.
There's a range issue, and
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
forth. But in any event, I think there's plenty of evidence here that the mission you have of fair and effective enforcement of environmental laws, particularly using, as I was discussing here, the injunctive relief, is not being fulfilled based on the numbers that we're seeing. With that, I would yield back my time because I'm over. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
I thank our chairwoman and ranking member for hosting this hearing today. Ms. Boudin, I want to talk about budget, because the fiscal year 2019 budget request called for nearly a 25% cut to the EPA. And to put that in perspective, if those cuts were enacted, they would push the EPA's budget to its lowest level since 1991. I would point out that compliance and enforcement activities are not spared from these proposed cuts. How would these proposals, if they were enacted, have impacted enforcement activities?
I don't know. What we have, we would be using the resources that Congress gives us as effectively and as efficiently as we can, and we would be focusing on the largest cases. We do still take a lot of very small cases. A large percentage of these cases, conclusions that have been discussed today, are still very small cases, and so we would focus on the most important cases, and we'd focus on making sure that we were providing assistance and training to states.
So we've been talking about sort of the decline in what we can recognize as enforcement activity. Are you saying that there would be no correlation in bringing action between a reduction in your budget and the fact that you're at a 30-year low in that enforcement?
So what I said was that we would be further focused on the most important actions. I didn't say it would have no impact, but in terms of if we were not going to be taking an action, it would definitely be only in situations where there wasn't, immediate public health or environmental threat, situations where we knew the state was already dealing with the issue. So again, we would be very strategic.
So, Ms. Boudin, even though Congress prevented those cuts from being enacted, I'm deeply concerned that certain damage was done. I'm concerned that those proposed cuts sent a signal to regulated communities and EPA employees that the administration doesn't take its responsibility to enforce environmental laws seriously. Are you concerned that the previously proposed budget cuts to EPA sent a message to polluters and EPA staff that the agency doesn't take environmental enforcement seriously?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, I have gone around to the regions. I've talked to my staff to make sure that they know that we do very much value the work that we do, and that enforcement is incredibly important.
So I want to shift gears just a tad bit. 2/3, I'm from New York, of New Yorkers regularly breathe in unhealthy air due to smog. That's why New York State and City has actually sued the EPA last month regarding its failure to enforce the Clean Air Act. The, quote, good neighbor, end quote, provision of the act requires the EPA to police air pollution in states not not living up to federal standards, so it doesn't blow downwind to states like mine. This lawsuit results from the EPA's decision to reverse its prior finding that ozone pollution should be subject to this provision. Why did the EPA take this action, which harms the health of New Yorkers?
So, Congressman, I don't actually have any background information on that. That would be a regulation that would come out of the Air Office.
Okay, and so you wouldn't be looking into a lawsuit that has implications around enforcement and regulation?
That our general counsel's office would be managing that lawsuit. My office would not have anything to do with it.
Very well. Well, then let me share just this one last question, since I have a short amount of time. Will next year's budget propose similar draconian reductions for EPA's like last year's proposal?
I do not know.
You don't know. Will you be advocating for a more robust budget?
So I believe the president's budget is going to come out in March next month.
Absolutely.
So
Well, if the past president is prologue, what are your feelings about that? Given what has all been revealed here today.
I support the president's budget.
Oh, very well. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman DeGette, for hosting this hearing, and welcome, Administrator Boudin.
Thank you.
Civil penalties are an important enforcement tool at EPA. Civil penalties are monetary assessments paid by a regulated entity because of a violation or noncompliance. They are designed to recover the financial benefit a company has obtained by breaking the law and impose added costs to deter firms from breaking the law again in the future. So, Administrator Boudin, would you agree that civil penalties are an important enforcement tool for EPA?
Yes, I do.
And according to EPA's annual enforcement report for fiscal year 2018, EPA obtained just $69.4 million in federal administrative and civil judicial penalties. A recently released report cited by the Washington Post states that this is the lowest amount of civil penalties recovered since the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance was established back in 1994. Even excluding the huge BP penalty, the Washington Post reports, and I quote, "The Trump administration's civil monetary penalties last year represented a roughly 55% drop from the annual average. In fact, according to a February 8th Washington Post report, the $69 million in civil penalties leveled by EPA represents the lowest in nearly a quarter century." So, Administrator Boudin, is that accurate?
I can look at I know what our results say. I don't have the data that you have, but I also would note that penalties go up and down. And
okay, but could you get back to us if it's accurate?
Certainly.
Thank you. In the roughly 25-year history of the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, has the amount of civil penalties leveled by EPA ever been this low?
In the 11 years of data I have in front of me, no, but I don't have it back further.
Thank you. And Ms. Boudin, some have suggested that annual total penalties can be strongly influenced by the presence of one or two large cases. To illustrate this point, your staff provided to the committee analysis, which shows annual results for civil penalties after removing two large cases, that being BP and VW. In your testimony, you mentioned that for 2019, the state of California and EPA secured a civil penalty of some $305 million. So my question, Administrator Boudin, what is the amount of civil penalties for fiscal year 2019 to date if you exclude the large Fiat Chrysler penalty? I have this chart that was provided by your agency that shows this huge spike with the Fiat Chrysler penalty. This has been adjusted for BP and VW. So I've heard all the talk about spikes and peaks and valleys. I've heard about the averaging throughout the years. But in a 30-year span, if you take this out, what is the amount of civil penalties for fiscal year 2019 to date?
I'm going to have to provide that for the record.
Yeah, that's very important information because that spike looks like the whole picture for 2019. again, Ms. Boudin. On the second panel, Eric Shaffer, who spent 12 years at the EPA as the director of the agency's Office of Civil Enforcement, will testify that EPA's enforcement results for 2018 fiscal year were historically low. His testimony indicates, and I quote, "The number of inspections and investigations, civil cases either referred to the Justice Department for prosecution or concluded with a consent decree, criminal cases opened, and defendants charged with environmental crimes fell to their lowest levels since at least 2001. Looked at another way, inspections and investigations in the last year were 40% below their average level during the last two administrations. EPA referred 123 cases to the Justice Department in 2018, compared to an average of 211 per year under President Obama and 304 under President Bush." Ms. Boudin, that certainly seems like a decrease in enforcement activities. How do you respond to that?
You can't look at averages when you're talking about enforcement. We don't set quotas. We don't say we're going to ask the staff to reach an average number of penalties, and you have to get, what, $500 million penalties a year, and that you have to go out and increase penalties to reach that number. We don't say you have to reach an average number of cases. And again, we want them to be very judicious and strategic and put the resources where it matters. We do, however, we do try and set targets for inspections, because I absolutely agree that we need to be out there. We need to be inspecting for compliance. We need to have the enforcement presence out there.
I'm just concerned that EPA has taken the environmental cop off the beat and will go on polluting without fear of repercussions. So with that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Mullen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I ask unanimous consent to include a letter from Senator Unruh regarding the EPA enforcement into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Ma'am, thank you so much for being here. And I've got to tell you, coming from a business owner that has owns an environmental company, it is refreshing to have an EPA now that is willing to work with us. We have DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, inside Oklahoma that obviously partners with the EPA. And underneath the last administration, it felt like every time the EPA showed up at a job site or a place of business, they were there just to look at ways to write fines. They were not there trying to work with the industry, trying to improve it. And in fact, if you even questioned it, you typically got a supervisor that came back with more penalties. And so it was to the point where you couldn't work with the agency anymore. So the idea that you're bringing it back to working with industry, I personally appreciate it, and I can tell you industries appreciate it too. It's always been a mindset that the government is supposed to create an environment for the economy to thrive, to allow the industry to work with best practices. And I feel like that's coming back around to the EPA. So thank you so much. Got a couple questions here. My understanding is that OECA is trying to use the right tools to focus on major, even criminal compliance issues. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So if that's accurate, then would you attribute the new efficiencies to the uptick in criminal enforcement cases open in fiscal year 18?
I'm not sure it's an efficiency issue, but we've certainly been very, very supportive of the criminal program. I'm happy to see that the number of cases that they've opened for investigation has gone up.
What type of compliance issues do you think you're dealing with right now?
Across the country?
Well, just for the most. Just give me maybe the top three.
Yeah. So we're concerned about, for example, the number of Clean Water Act permit holders that are in significant noncompliance with their permits, and so we are trying to work with states to get that number down. We're also concerned about drinking water, and we're talking about developing a new national compliance initiative on drinking water, because I think everyone around the country is concerned that we have noncompliance. We have cases underway but we also know that there are small systems out there that need help.
Are you having issues with discharge permits for like maybe municipalities?
So they are a big part of the universe that's in noncompliance with their permits that we track. And again, a lot of municipalities that had both combined sewer overflows and sanitary sewer overflows. A lot of those are already under either an administrative order or a consent decree or a permit to get them back into compliance.
Does that have to do with their treatment centers that are maybe outdated and they can't afford to put in new ones, or?
That can very much be the case. And when we deal with those issues, then we look at the time frame over which they would need to come back.
So they were under, let's say they were under, when they built it, they were compliant, and then new standards have increased, which made them out of compliant, or is it because they have equipment that's down?
It's both.
It's both. Do you have enough federal agents to enforce your criminal investigations?
So I've authorized the hiring to take us up to 164 agents. We don't have that number on board right now. Again, it takes about 6 months to bring
How
in
many
an
are you
agent.
behind?
Pardon? I think right now we have about 147, but we have a number of hires in the works. They have to go through a lot. They carry guns. They have to go through a lot of background checks.
So what's the time frame to be able to get them up to speed and have
Can
the
I answer
correct
for the record? It takes a long time. It's not getting them up to speed. It's getting them onboarded. It's getting them hired.
Now,
But
what
again,
is,
I authorized that back in June or July, and so we're working hard to get those.
so what's the
folks
number,
on.
the total number of vacancies you have?
Well, I believe, again, I have some people coming on in March.
Okay.
They were supposed to come on in January, but they didn't because we were shut down. But they're coming on in March, and so I think today it's about 147. We're trying to get it up to 164, but I don't know how many are coming in within the next few weeks.
Real quick, one last question. Why do the EPA agents need to be carrying guns?
Yeah. So so they go out and they serve search warrants. And sometimes people resent the fact that they are, in fact, searching their facility. And we have had.
So it's for protection purposes?
Absolutely.
It's
We
not
have had-
enforcement, it's protection?
It's protection. We have had
Right, that's-
situations.
Right, that's what I was
That's
figuring.
exactly what it is.
It's not for enforcement purposes, it's
No,
for self-protection.
it's absolutely for personal protection.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you so much, I appreciate it. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Boudin, for being here with us. My first job after graduating college was working as an economist for the TSCA section of the Office of Toxic Substances under
Okay.
TSCA. And that drove me from being an economist to going to law school. And then as a lawyer, one of the first things I did was work on Superfund as an environmental lawyer after it was reauthorized in the mid-1980s. Yeah. And I want to talk about that program for a few moments. The Superfund program is a critical public health program that's made an enormous difference in cleaning up dangerous contaminated sites across the country. And there's a lot of effective tools in private enforcement, but public enforcement, EPA enforcement staff, still has a lot of responsibility for identifying responsible parties and ensuring that the appropriate people pay to get the cleanups done. In 2018, Superfund enforcement generated the lowest level of private party cleanup commitments in 10 years. Is that your understanding?
I'll take your word for it. I don't
Okay.
have my Superfund slide in front of me, but I can pull it out.
Okay. And also, I understand that the volume of contaminated soil and water to be cleaned up also dropped significantly in that time period. Is that also your understanding?
So I do know that that the volume of hazardous waste, well, the volume of contaminated soil and water in 18, I need my chart. I know that it was higher than it was in 2015, higher than it was in 2016. I believe it was less than 2017,
Okay.
however.
I've been thinking over the last 10 years. That's my understanding. In any event, I don't think the need for cleanup has dissipated. The number of National Priority List sites, NPL sites, has remained consistent for years. And the pace of cleanups has slowed markedly. Is it fair to attribute that to lesser enforcement? What do you attribute that to?
So I'm not sure, I know that this administration, we've been very focused on increasing the pace of cleanups in the Superfund program, and that's by focusing management attention, making sure that we don't have log jams, and that we threaten, if private parties aren't stepping up, that we bring them to the table through the threat of enforcement.
I guess the bottom line is that the number of NPL sites has not been reduced. Isn't that our goal, is to get these things cleaned up and off the list?
It is, and in fact, under this administration, we've had more deletions. I believe I think 22 sites were deleted from the NPL this past year, which is more than probably any year. I'd have to get the exact number, but it's certainly a huge increase over prior years.
What would be great is if I can ask you to follow up.
Absolutely.
Those things right in front of you. Sometimes
Sure.
it's a little bit of a surprise. I'd love to get those numbers from
Sure.
you on the cleanups. The threat of enforcement carries particular weight in Superfund because the agency has the authority to seek treble damages for cleanup costs from recalcitrant parties. How often have you used the treble damage authority during your tenure, Ms. Boudin?
So I'll have to, how many, these are 106 actions. I know that we have threatened them, and then the private parties have come to the table in some cases that I have been briefed on, but I wouldn't know every instance, and so I'll have to get back, because that would happen out in the region, so I'll have to get back to you for the record on the number of 106 orders we've issued.
Would you be able to share which cases those were with us?
I believe those would be public.
I'd like to
believe so.
I'd like to compare your threats to the results, if that's okay with you.
Let me take that back. I believe those are public. If we actually issued the order, then that would, I believe those are public.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Boudin, this concludes your testimony, but I did want to raise a couple things with you. Number one, several of the members today asked you to supplement your answers, and we expect that in a timely fashion. I'm sure you can do that. When do you think you can get that information to us?
That I don't know, but I understand completely the need to
30
be
days,
responsive.
you think? Well, we're going to hope for 30 days.
Okay.
One of the reasons I ask is the majority has sent your office 5 letters requesting information and documents since the beginning of this Congress. And as a rule, we ask for 2 weeks. We know you can't always get that in the 2 weeks, but we haven't gotten any of the information. So I would ask you to go back to your office and see if you can get responses to those 5 letters as well. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thanks. Just one last question, then I'll ask Mr. Guthrie if he has any last questions. In your response to Mr. Mullen, you said that you have a goal of increasing your number of criminal investigators to 164.
Yes.
How many investigators is the EPA required to have under the law?
There isn't a...
There's no requirement?
There's no requirement.
Okay. My staff says it's 200, so that's not accurate.
I believe, Pollution Prosecution Act of, 1990, said that in 1995, that by 1995, the number should be 200, and it was in 1995. But we don't have an ongoing obligation to maintain 200.
Under that act?
Correct.
That's your interpretation of that act?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Guthrie, do you have any additional questions?
No, thank you. I just want to thank you for coming to testify before us today. And I think there were several questions asked for timely responses to the questions. I think that's appropriate, and appreciate you coming before today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. With that, you're dismissed, Ms. Boudin. And I would now ask the second panel witnesses to please come to the table. Thank you so much all for coming. I'd now like to introduce our second panel of witnesses. First, okay, you guys are not sitting in the order on this, but I'm going to introduce you in the order of this. Bruce Buckheit, who's an analyst and consultant and the former director of the Air Enforcement Division of the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. Dr. Bakaya Nelson, is that right, Dr. Nelson? Bakaya? Executive Director of the Air Alliance Houston. Eric Shaffer, the Executive Director of the Environmental Integrity Project. Dr. Chris Sellers, Professor of History and Director of Center for Study of Inequality and Social Justice at Stony Brook University. Dr. Jay Shimshak, who's the Associate Professor of Public Policy and Economics, Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, and the Honorable Ronald J. Tempest, partner at Vincent & Elkins, former Assistant Attorney General, Environment and Natural Resources Division, U.S. Department of Justice. I want to thank all of you for appearing today, and I'm sure you're aware the committee's holding an investigative hearing, and when we do so, we have a practice of taking testimony under oath. Does anyone have an objection to taking your testimony under oath? Let the record reflect the witnesses responded no. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you're entitled to be accompanied by counsel. Does anyone here desire to be accompanied by counsel today? No. Let the record reflect the witnesses have responded no. So if you would please rise and raise your right. So now the chair will recognize the witnesses for a 5-minute summary of their written statements. In front of you is a microphone and a series of lights. The light will turn yellow when you have a minute left and red to indicate your time has expired. And I'm going to have you testify in the order in which you're sitting. So Mr. Shaffer, we'll start with you, and thank you so much. You've got 5 minutes.
Is this better? Thank you for the opportunity to testify. If I may, I'd like to, I am Eric Shaffer, Director of the Environmental Integrity Project, and I did spend time at EPA as Director of the Civil Enforcement Program. And if I may, I'd like to address some of the issues that came up in prior testimony and have my written statement be in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. So to take some of the points that were discussed, I just want to make clear that EPA's enforcement program does not just measure penalties and fines. It's always, at least for 25 years, measured enforcement outcomes. Those include the amount of pollution reduced through enforcement action and the amount of money spent on cleanup. And those measures are reported faithfully every year. They are also at historic lows in 2018. I believe the chair made those points, but just wanted to reinforce that those outcome measures are also down. Also, I think it's important just to get back to basics and understand that enforcement protects people where they live and work, protects their health and environment where they live and work. So when a community is exposed to a blast of lead or a cloud of carcinogens from, let's say, a petrochemical plant, you really can't answer the problem by saying, you know, don't worry, sulfur dioxide emissions are down nationwide. They really want something done about what's going on in their neighborhood. That is enforcement work, and I think it is important to just keep that in front of us. Next, EPA has had active programs to encourage voluntary compliance, including the disclosure and correction of violations for many, many years. They're important. They're necessary. They work in tandem with enforcement. It's not an either-or situation. And in fact, I think those voluntary efforts will start to shrink if enforcement starts to fall off. Looking at this issue maybe more philosophically, if you're a large refinery, let's say, or a large power plant, you aren't supposed to wait until the government comes calling to start complying with the law. So that kind of voluntary compliance is not what we should be talking about. We should be giving people incentives to get ahead of the game and stay in compliance before the enforcement program finds you. And when the program does find you, if you're looking at serious violations, and in some of these cases involve thousands of violations over many years, you should pay a penalty. And there should be no apology for that. And that penalty should sting. It should make you think twice about doing it again. That's fundamental. So just want to say penalties do matter. They're not unimportant. And if you stop basically making people pay those penalties and fines, you won't get a lot of voluntary compliance. It's good to hear that the assistant administrator appreciates the great work of the enforcement program, and I believe Ms. Boudin means it. I can't help but say these are the same great people the administration keeps trying to pink slip. So the attitude seems to be, you do great work, we just need less of it, right? That seems to be the message from the administration. You just can't have it both ways. You'll hear a lot about cooperative federalism being used to sell the idea of a retreating EPA enforcement presence. That's a handoff of EPA responsibilities to states that do not have the budgets and in many cases do not have the same authority EPA has to enforce the law. You violate the Clean Air Act and EPA is coming at you, you can pay up to $100,000 per day for each violation. That's under the statutes you wrote. In many states, $10,000 is the maximum. You're just starting with fewer cards. You can't negotiate an outcome nearly as well as EPA can in that kind of lopsided situation. I just want to close by referring members to the charts at the back. There I've tried to show a list of plants where the communities face exposure to toxic pollutants and other noxious chemicals and hazards. And those have been documented by EPA in inspections or through monitoring records. They've been sitting for years with no enforcement action. In some cases, thousands of violations at these plants. So where's the beef? We want to focus on outcome. We should be asking what's going to happen with those cases. Last but not least, EPA will never run out of work. I've given you examples of the tips and complaints called into the National Enforcement Response Center that involve blowing lead dust into the environment, burning hexavalent chromium, dumping pollutants into the air, land, water, sewers, and those need attention. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Dr. Sellers, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Chris Sellers, and I'm a professor of environmental history, and I'm director of the Center for the Study of Inequalities, Social Justice, and Policy at Stony Brook University. But I'm here today as a member of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, a network of more than 170 academics and other professionals and volunteers. We've been monitoring change at the US EPA since the beginning of the Trump administration. I head up an edgy research team interviewing recently retired and current EPA employees. Our early finds have been published in major scholarly outlets like the American Journal of Public Health. Over the last year, I've joined with edgy colleagues Leif Fredrickson and Marianne Sullivan and others to study this most critical function of the agency, which we learned to be threatened, enforcement. We've researched the EPA's own public data and records, supplemented by internal documents provided by our interviewees, all point with startling unanimity to the same conclusion. Over the past 2 years, EPA enforcement has declined significantly. The only question has been just how badly. Well, fortunately, EPA has now released its fiscal year 2018 data, and that's provided us and everyone else with clear answers. So with my testimony, I've included a 32-page compendium of charts and other analysis of this data, combining it with earlier publicly available EPA enforcement data. We have the links on our website if you wish to follow them. It shows a decline in enforcement that is dramatic and alarming, with a speed and scale that have only a single rival in the agency's half-century history. And that's the early Reagan administration in the early 80s, when they actually broke up EPA's enforcement wing. Most of the available measures of the agency's performance are registering 10 or 15-year lows at the very least. To find a lower number of civil judicial referrals, we've talked about this a little bit. These are for the most egregious offenses to the Justice Department. You have to go back to 1976. And as we said, total civil cases to 1982. People have already talked about that. By almost any measures, EPA is doing worse. Other measures by which EPA assesses its own enforcement don't run as far back, yet the Trump's years still vie with the lowest ever recorded. Civil cases concluded to 1994, civil fines levied, lowest since 1987, and I can go on. EPA has been curbing its ability not just to punish, but to find violators. In 2017, inspections, these, checking for compliance, those were the lowest in 25 years, and then they fell still lower in 2017. Drops in inspections, which are the front end of the enforcement pipeline, strongly suggest that the decline in EPA enforcement has not yet hit bottom. By almost any measure of its actions, EPA is backing off from its longstanding role as the nation's top environmental cop. What EPA employees have told us in the course of our interviewing project strongly confirms the picture suggested by EPA's enforcement numbers, Ms. Boudin's testimony aside. Over the last 2 years, my team has conducted 100 confidential interviews with recently retired and current EPA staff, a quarter of whom work directly in enforcement. Of the last 24 interviews, including those in enforcement and out, all drawing on Trump administration experience, 75% of these mentioned problems with enforcement. It's widely known. Their testimony offers a concrete and plausible account also of what has driven the drop. Enforcement staff have gotten a message that industry is in the driver's seat, that they are to bow to its request. We've heard stories about the staff exodus, about members of the regulated communities becoming emboldened. We've documented a widespread belief among EPA staff that in practice, this so-called cooperative federalism is turning out to mean deregulation, plain and simple. With rare uniformity, the evidence we found adds up to a convincing picture of a sad truth. EPA is extracting its own teeth. This is not just some bureaucratic reshuffle. Less enforcement will have real consequences for many Americans, especially those living nearest to these potential environmental threats. In 2008, under George Bush, EPA enforcement actions protected 8 million people's drinking water. And last year, that was down to 500,000. So a plummet of several fold. That level of inaction, that nearly begs for another Flint. Not only is the enforcement drop corroding the federal commitment to protect health and the environment, it is weakening the ability of states to do so. Already, we believe, it has all but ensured significant deterioration of our nation's public health and environment in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair DeGette.
Hang on, Mr. Buckheit,
Yes.
for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members for inviting me here today. I have been involved in Clean Air Act enforcement issues in a variety of roles since 1984. I would like to focus my remarks this morning on the recent policy statements of the Enforcement Office and advise the committee of what I think that portrays. Overall, and so I would ask that my written testimony be submitted for the record.
Without objection, all the witnesses' testimony will be part of the record.
Overall, the broad decline in air enforcement metrics, in my view, is neither surprising nor accidental. This view is based on my years of experience in this area, including my personal interactions on many of these same air enforcement issues with Acting Administrator Wheeler and Assistant Administrator Wareham in the 1998 to 2003 timeframe. It is also based on recent agency public statements, rulemaking proposals, and revised enforcement policies. Notably, these new enforcement policies are devoid of any measures to deter future violations of the Act. The administration's push to exit the enforcement arena ignores the history of air pollution control. Prior to 1970, states were primarily responsible for air pollution control. Federal authority over air pollution was either entirely missing or merely advisory. Over time, however, it became clear that deferring to the states did not work. And so Congress adopted the 1970 Clean Air Act to end the race to the bottom among states. The CAA provides that once EPA has provided 30 days notice to a state, EPA may enforce as appropriate. Enforcement policies that manage the federal, state, and local roles have been developed over the years and work well. But this does not mean that EPA and state program managers must always agree. EPA has a job to do, and many states do not have the political will to force their companies to retrofit with expensive pollution controls. This fact is documented by years of state enforcement records. There is no reason to believe that EPA ceding near total enforcement authority to the states will alter the value that the different states place on environmental enforcement. EPA has now declared mission accomplished and deprioritized new air enforcement in what's called large emitting sectors. It has also likely walked away from ongoing investigations commenced under the previous administrations. While EPA says that it will complete the ongoing enforcement cases, that is to say, matters that have already been referred to the Justice Department, it does not commit to complete the ongoing enforcement investigations in these sectors that were commenced under the Obama administration. EPA justifies abandoning the utility sector because emissions have declined as a result of enforcement actions taken against some companies years ago and subsequent EPA regulations. However, the EPA investigations during my tenure and more recent investigations in the last few years each show substantial noncompliance within the sector, and this is the single largest polluting sector on a unit-by-unit basis in the country. This is where the money is. This sector also has a fairly substantial percentage of units that are not well controlled. My recollection is it's about a quarter of the plants don't have full-on SO2 controls, and half or more are not fully controlled for nitrogen oxides. EPA says that it is done with the other sectors because it has, quotes, required controls or commenced investigations at 90% of or more of the facilities in those sectors. However, commencing an investigation is not the same thing as completing an enforcement action. As it abandons the existing sectors, EPA does not identify any other large emitting industrial sectors to replace them. You heard earlier about targeting. Well, there is no targeting in EPA's new plan. To say that you're going to target non-attainment areas provides no guidance at all. Where and how are you going to reduce emissions within the non-attainment areas? Several months before I left EPA, senior management had advised me that on a forward-looking basis, we would not be enforcing the rules as they were on the books, but as EPA intended them to be and had proposed them to be under changed regulations. We now see the administration again seeking to change the new source review rules, and I strongly suspect that what enforcement decisions are being made on the basis of what they would like the new rules to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buckheit. Dr. Shimshak, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Jay Shimshak. I'm Associate Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Virginia's Frank Batterton School of Leadership and Public Policy. I've been conducting research on environmental enforcement and compliance for nearly 20 years now. Recently, I've devoted considerable efforts to synthesizing the relevant state of knowledge in the literature, and my testimony today emphasizes two themes. First, the evidence indicates that traditional monitoring and enforcement actions get results. And second, the evidence indicates that further devolution of environmental oversight from federal and regional offices to state or local agencies may have important consequences for human health and the natural environment. Before proceeding, it's worth noting what I mean by the evidence. Large and growing multidisciplinary literature assesses environmental compliance by rigorously analyzing data. The methods are diverse. The evidence spans air, water, waste, oil, and other pollution. So some details on effectiveness. My work and that of many others shows that environmental inspections and fines enhance compliance and reduce pollution. Inspections and fines reduce immediate harm as evaluations and requirements of administrative or judicial actions generate pollution reductions. Second, inspections and fines improve future environmental performance at the evaluated or sanctioned facility. Third, inspections and fines spill over to improve environmental performance at other facilities located under the same jurisdiction as the sanctioned facility via regulator reputation effect. And fourth, inspections and fines can induce facilities to go beyond compliance and reduce pollution below their permitted levels. The literature on the effectiveness of alternative approaches to promoting compliance, like enforcement actions without penalties, voluntary programs, cooperative arrangements, information disclosure, and compliance assistance, is much smaller, and the results are considerably more mixed. My read of this literature is that environmental compliance tools beyond traditional inspections and fines can be effective when used as complements to traditional regulatory approaches, but not as substitutes to traditional approaches. Some details on devolution. As has been stated at several points today, the majority of environmental permitting, inspection, and sanction activities are currently delegated to state and local authorities. Scholars have long noted advantages and disadvantages of this system. One advantage is that state and local agencies may have better information on local conditions and preferences, so activities can be more carefully tailored to local circumstances. On the other hand, the literature shows that decentralized oversight has disadvantages as well. The evidence suggests that devolved oversight can cause states to perceive a need to compete with one another to attract new business with lax environmental enforcement. Decentralized enforcement can fail to adequately address pollution impacts crossing state borders or attributable to large firms operating in many states simultaneously. Decentralization can heighten incentives for local regulators to pursue the interest of the regulated community rather than the interest of the general public. My own recent work also illustrates another parallel of devolution. Colleagues and I showed that enforcement in a highly devolved system can lead to unintended enforcement spillovers across borders. Increases in enforcement pressure in one state provide incentives for competitors in other states to increase production and pollution. We show that this happens under the U.S. Clean Water Act. Pollution reductions from more enforcement in one state can be offset by increased pollution by competitors in other states. Results suggest that enforcement oversight may require more rigorous regional and national coordination than is currently available. Some implications. The evidence suggests that all else equal, reductions in EPA monitoring and enforcement actions will sacrifice benefits for environmental quality, human health, property values, and other endpoints. In principle, reductions in EPA monitoring and enforcement could be offset by countervailing increases in state and local environmental monitoring and enforcement activity. As a matter of practice, further devolution of oversight comes with risks for environmental quality, human health, and property values. Chair DeGette, distinguished members, this concludes my remarks. I hope these comments provide a perspective from academic research on the important matters at hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Nelson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, and members of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee for the opportunity to testify here today about EPA's enforcement record and the implications for the 8-county Houston region. I am the Executive Director of Air Alliance Houston, a local nonprofit organization that works to improve air quality and public health through research, education, and advocacy. Illegal releases of air pollution are all too common in Texas. Industry says these releases are unavoidable, yet they also know the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and Texas Commission for Environmental Quality will not hold them accountable. This leaves people across Houston and Texas almost defenseless against harmful air pollution. More than 400 petrochemical facilities, including 2 of the 4 largest U.S. oil refineries, reside in Harris County. Emissions events in Texas have been found to lead to the premature deaths of at least 16 people and $148 million in health-related costs per year. TCEQ, however, fails to penalize violators 97% of the time, according to an analysis by Environment Texas. This general unwillingness to enforce the law has essentially given industry a pass to poison. The Valero Houston refinery, for example, released significant amounts of hydrogen cyanide into the air in 2016, despite not having a permit to do so. The consequence? There has been none to date. Neither EPA nor TCEQ has taken enforcement action. This is extremely concerning because the Valero refinery is located beside Houston's Manchester community, where 97% of the residents are people of color, 37% live in poverty, and 90% live within 1 mile of an industrial facility that is subject to the EPA's risk management program. Many homes are within yards of the refinery, which has self-reported more than 200 unauthorized releases of toxic air pollutants since January 2003. High exposures to hydrogen cyanide can be extremely harmful to people's health and can result in death within minutes, while exposure at lower concentrations can cause eye irritation, headache, confusion, nausea, among other health effects. Hurricane Harvey serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of millions of Americans who live near chemical plants. It also revealed how ill-equipped the state of Texas and the EPA are to handle disasters. During Harvey, over 8 million pounds of pollution escaped into the air because of inadequate preparation for the storm by industry, EPA, and TCEQ. The biggest emissions release occurred in Galena Park, a predominantly Latinx and low-wealth community along the Houston Ship Channel. 2 storage tanks at the Magellan Terminal released more than 11,000 barrels of gasoline. The company did not report the incident until 11 days after the spill occurred, according to the Houston Chronicle. Lifelong Galena Park resident Juan Flores, who works as a community organizer for Airlines Houston, said he and his neighbors smelled the strong odor of petroleum for several days after Harvey. People complained about the extreme stench, burning eyes, and more. They closed doors and windows, but many still could not escape the odor. Yet EPA and TCEQ have taken no enforcement action against Magellan. Galena Park is just one of many examples of how communities suffered public health impacts from the storm and of the inaction by EPA and TCEQ. During and in the immediate weeks after the storm, several organizations collected information and surveyed residents about the public health impacts. Many reported worsening health conditions. Yet EPA and TCEQ are not holding the polluters accountable and have not yet required action to prevent similar problems in the future. Texas needs robust oversight from EPA because the state also limits the ability of local agencies to pursue enforcement actions against industrial polluters. Significant challenges exist to local enforcement of the Texas Clean Air Act. Specifically, one of the challenges to local enforcement of the Texas Clean Air Act is that in some types of cases, the city must notify the TCEQ of a violation and give the state agency the first opportunity to determine whether to pursue an enforcement action. However, as previously noted, TCEQ fails to penalize violators 97% of the time. Enforcement action is particularly critical for communities of color and low wealth, as hazardous facilities are disproportionately concentrated in these neighborhoods, compromising the health and safety of people with some of the greatest health challenges and the fewest resources to address these issues. The overwhelming majority of incidents that occurred during Harvey took place in or near environmental justice communities. Years ago, EPA had recognized the need to make preventing chemical disasters a national enforcement initiative, but communities in Houston haven't seen EPA make good on that promise. Even worse, after committing to an increase in enforcement resources to the most overburdened communities in EPA's Environmental Justice Strategic Plan, the agency is instead turning its back on communities that need enforcement the most, like Houston. These communities simply cannot rely on compassion or the goodwill of industry to comply with the law. In conclusion, I want to thank the subcommittee for conducting this hearing and for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Doctor. Mr. Tempest, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair DeGette, Ranking Member Guthrie, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and offer my perspective on environmental enforcement efforts. Just briefly, by way of my background on this, I've spent approximately 20 of my 30-year legal career focused on issues of enforcement of federal law and regulation, seeing it both from the perspective of the government and the perspective of those who are subject to those laws and regulations. I started by spending 12 years at the Justice Department, beginning as an AUSA, indeed in Congressman Castor's home location as an AUSA in Tampa, Florida. I then spent, after 6 years as a line attorney, I spent 6 years as a political appointee, including in 2 Senate-confirmed posts as a United States Attorney in the Southern District of Illinois, and then later as the Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division. The ENRD, as it's often called in shorthand, just like you've been referencing OECA here at EPA, the ENRD is the group of lawyers that really take on all of the major federal environmental cases that end up in the courts. So the most significant, including, of course, the most significant federal environmental enforcement cases. And then following that time at the Justice Department, I've spent the last 10 years in private practice, assisting clients, as I say, as they assess their environmental obligations and address potential violations. From that, there are sort of 5 overall major observations I'd offer to the committee today. First, as there's been a great deal of discussion, both EPA and DOJ do try to measure and report on their enforcement results, and EPA is currently using 12 major metrics. This data is, as I often put it, noisy. Single case outcomes from year to year can drive the annual results, making it sometimes difficult to discern fundamental trends. And so I'd urge some amount of caution in drawing strong conclusions based on any single subset of those metrics or from even a narrow, relatively narrow period of years, a single year or 2 years. As I look at the most recent EPA data that's been published and that the committee's been discussing, I see what I regard as a pretty typical mixed bag. Some enforcement metrics are up from what was observed during periods of the prior administration. Some are down, some are roughly in line with prior history. Thus, to me, that data doesn't overall suggest there has been an abandonment of environmental enforcement. Second, that kind of a level of stability there is not surprising to me, given that between EPA and DOJ, there's a very large and dedicated group of career professionals. And that group ensures that regardless of administration, there is always likely to be a meaningful and continuous enforcement effort, as there should be. Third, for all of the attention that these annual statistics may get, at the end of the day, they are proxies, and they are somewhat poor proxies for the real objective here, which is consistent compliance with our environmental regulations. Enforcement is not an end in itself. The purpose of enforcement is to incentivize and, when necessary, to coerce compliance with our environmental regulations. And this leads to my 4th point, which is that we should always be open to the possibilities that there are better ways or alternative ways to secure compliance. Use of the enforcement stick need not be and likely should not be the only strategy. In this respect, things like voluntary self-reporting programs and similar incentive systems that aren't always accompanied by formal enforcement actions or a formal enforcement stat, as my people in the government sometimes put it, those programs can be very important nevertheless. Finally, I'll just say I've yet to meet the client who has taken the view that because there is some impression or some reporting has been discussed here that enforcement efforts are down, it's going to cut back on its own environmental and compliance efforts. And one of the things that I think the Congress and this country should be proud of is that we've now had a robust body of environmental statutes for several decades, and that has in fact spurred within the corporate community them to develop large environmental health and safety professional staffs who do believe in and are committed to complying with the law and who are well aware that there's an active and effective set of career professionals at the enforcement agencies, federal, state, and local. They're aware that there's more than one agency on the job besides EPA under our scheme of cooperative federalism. Thus, to me, it's likely a false narrative to assume that even if enforcement efforts are subject to some adjustment at the federal level, the reaction within the regulated world is a corresponding increase in noncompliance. I simply don't tend to see that level of cause and effect in my own observations. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I appreciate the committee's invitation, and I look forward to addressing any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tempest, and thanks to the entire panel. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. On the first panel today, we heard about some of the key EPA enforcement mechanisms and how the enforcement figures have really just plummeted by pretty much any index under this administration. For example, we heard that EPA performed fewer inspections last year than it had in over a decade. We heard that the injunctive relief figure was the lowest in 15 years. We heard that the civil penalties were the lowest in nearly 25 years, and the number of civil cases initiated was the lowest since 1982. So I just want to ask some questions about this. Mr. Shaffer, in your written testimony, you said, quote, the EPA's enforcement results for the 2018 fiscal year were historically low by almost every measure. Is that accurate?
That's right.
Okay. Now, you're a former EPA career enforcement official. And so I don't know if you heard Ms. Boudin's testimony, but she seemed to think that these statistics were unimportant, and then in fact EPA's enforcement activities were just fine for a variety of reasons. What do you think the low numbers tell you about the EPA's enforcement of environmental laws by this administration, and are you concerned about some of these indicators, and if so, which ones?
So, Madam Chairman, I am concerned. I think, first of all, these are measures that the EPA enforcement program itself has selected to reflect their performance and what you get out of enforcement.
So it's their own statistics.
They're their own statistics, and these are performance measures that are published year after year. And I think it is true that across the board, with very few exceptions, they are all very far down. So they're well below not just prior years, the prior few years, but historical averages, and that is of concern.
Mr. Buckheit, you're also a former EPA career enforcement official. So do you agree with Mr. Shaffer that these indices can be used to see whether the nation's environmental laws are being adequately enforced?
Yes, I do. I mean, they're all sort of a mosaic that look at different parts of the program, and when you put them together, you get an overall picture of decline.
And an overall picture of decline? Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. Now, last year, the president's budget request called for a nearly 25% cut to the agency. Had Congress not prevented those cuts from taking place, the budget would have been at its lowest level since 1991. So, Mr. Shaffer, I wanted to ask you, what message did last year's budget request send to polluters and EPA's own staff about the approach to environmental enforcement?
That enforcement doesn't matter. Enforcement requires staff. You can't do the work without people. You're trying to cut the budget by a quarter. You're telling the staff their work doesn't matter.
Now, what did you make of Ms. Boudin's statement just a few minutes ago that irrespective of what the president's budget for next year is, she's going to support it? What do you think that message that sends in terms of enforcement?
Well, I think, I suppose she has to, as the...
Well, yeah, but I mean, what do you think, what message do you think that sends?
I think it's confused anyway. It's pretty hard to, constantly refer to the great work of the program at the same time that your president is trying to slash it by so much.
Thank you. Dr. Shimshak, I wanted to ask you, because Ms. Boudin seemed to indicate that, some of the national figures weren't so important because the EPA was working with the states on enforcement. And I think you would agree that state enforcement's important. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But is that in a vacuum, or is it important to do that in conjunction with these other efforts?
So I think provided states have the resources and the capacity, even then, my best guess is that further devolution may result in declines in environmental quality.
Why is that?
As I testified. Again, there are issues of spillovers across states when they're not well coordinated. There are issues of regulatory capture, et cetera. So the things that I mentioned in my testimony I do want to emphasize, states do great work.
Well, right, but
Yeah.
they can't do it in a vacuum.
But they're already doing the overwhelming majority of the day-to-day oversight. There's enormous variation in enforcement intensity across states, and states are already being asked repeatedly to do more with less.
Speaking about the enormous difference between enforcement and states, Dr. Nelson, I think that's what your testimony was about, is the enforcement by your state of Texas.
That's correct.
So do you think Texas can be relied on to do the environmental enforcement by itself?
I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So this has been an informative hearing, and I appreciate everybody being here. Mr. Tempest, in your testimony, you specifically talked about noisy metrics, and that single case outcomes can drive annual numeric enforcement results, reported by EPA and DOJ. Can you further get into that? I know you only had 5 minutes to make 5 points, but I'd like you to talk about how the metrics are noisy and how that can can show trends in reporting that may not be accurate.
So what I meant by noisy is that you can get particularly significant individual cases in any year that cause that year to spike. And that, and we've heard some discussions of those. BP in the year that matter was resolved, Volkswagen in the year that matter was resolved. And that feeds across the variety of metrics that you might have. In addition to some of these penalty ones, as was referenced, there's data on, for example, what's the level of commitments to clean up materials that have been achieved through various agreements and consent decrees. That as well can be very heavily influenced by a single case resolution with one big company in a single year.
Okay, you talked about, we've all talked about other measurements other than just enforcement, and I think some have said the trends were down across a lot of those measurements. What other measurement, given what EPA measures, what else do you think we should ask them to measure that would give us a better indication of what they're doing?
Well, I think you've heard a couple of good ideas from Ms. Boudin this morning when she talked about trying to find ways to capture times when they have worked effectively with the state to potentially do an inspection and help identify a problem that then the state takes the lead in working with the facility and resolving. You heard ideas, I think the tracking of the self-reports that they've begun, and I think is something of a more recent development. I mean, precedes this administration, but I think it's more recent, is a very helpful metric for folks to be watching and to see what that produces.
Okay, and also, Mr. Tempest, as you correctly noted in your testimony, the objective of EPA is to promote and ensure compliance with our environmental laws and regulations. In your opinion, what tool does EPA have that is most helpful in ensuring compliance with environmental laws and regulations?
I don't know that I have a single tool. I mean, that's what we're, I think, here to discuss today. I think, as said, it's the mosaic of tools, the threat of investigations, the use of, and bringing cases, the use of inspections, the working very cooperatively with states in the regime that Congress established of cooperative federalism. I mean, Congress anticipated the states to have a kind of primacy type role, and EPA working with them to support them are probably the three most important things.
So I always look in these hearings as something can result in Congress making corrections and fixes to this. That's one of the reasons we do this. So are there any tools that EPA does not have that would be helpful for it to have to help to ensure compliance with environmental laws and regulations?
There's nothing that occurs to me immediately. I think there are always sort of adjustments that you make in the program as you go along and as conditions change. I mean, as I noted in my testimony, there are some metrics, one of the metrics has been sliding for years and years and years. I take that to be a marker of success because it's showing that some of the worst problems in terms of pollution locations and pounds to be corrected have been dealt with, and now we're at a different point in our enforcement and compliance approach.
I know Kentucky had a program in OSHA, not EPA, but had a program that industry could invite OSHA inspectors in. And if they came in and found negligence, there were certain exceptions that they came in and found they immediately could find. But what they really did was come in at the invitation of the company, do inspections, here are things you improve, come back and do follow-up. So the goal of that was compliance, not necessarily just getting a fine to go move forward. And I don't know the data, because I like professors to do studies on things because data's data. But I don't know the result, but I would have to feel like that we were getting more compliance, even though we were getting, that's anecdotal, less enforcement dollars.
No, that sounds right to me. I mean, there is, as I say, a variety of facilities. They have staff. They do self-audits. They do inspections. They sometimes bring in third parties. But the government has a certain level of inspection expertise as well. And so a program that allows a company to draw on that expertise without necessarily feeling that its reward for that, if something is identified, is going to be, a massive penalty. That I can see how that program could be very successful in improving compliance outcomes.
All right, well, thank you, and I yield back. My time's expired.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to touch on EPA's 2018 annual enforcement numbers and the trends, including what the overall picture tells us about the lack of environmental enforcement under this administration. Mr. Shaffer, your organization recently analyzed EPA's enforcement trends in light of the agency's very own 2018 report. Broadly speaking, I think I heard you answer to Chairwoman DeGette that the message you take away is that they do not prioritize enforcement of our bedrock American environmental laws. Is that correct?
I think that's true.
Would you go as far as to say that EPA currently is abdicating its responsibility to the American public?
I would.
And Dr. Sellers, do you agree with that as well?
I agree with both those answers.
Because you recently contributed to a report on the erosion of EPA's enforcement. The same organization that developed this report analyzed the annual report. What else do you want the American people to understand is going on at EPA right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of things going on kind of below the publicity surface, below the level of the media, that a lot of the employees feel like that industry is absolutely calling the shots. This is a quote from one of our interviewees.
Yeah, can I just stop you there? You, in your testimony, you said that your organization conducted hundreds of interviews with recently retired and current EPA employees, and you say that they are, many told you of pressures applied by agency leadership explicitly urging EPA employees to go easy on industry. Give us some examples. What did they say? How many of the folks you interviewed
I would not
said
say
that?
hundreds. We did 100 interviews.
Okay.
Examples include, for instance, Scott Pruitt parading around the agency with a trade association group and then calling people in from the career staff, enforcement staff, to berate them and tell them they should listen to this trade association group. And I could multiply those stories. They're happening. They happened all around the agency, all these kinds of pressures that staff was under. And it registered. And so I think that's one of the big reasons. Also that that they've had to report even routine inspection initiatives now to the political leadership. They've had pushback from the regulated communities. It's been harder to do their jobs on the ground because of all the industry's feeling emboldened. For instance, one person doing housing inspection for lead, a childhood brain damager, found that landlords are not returning her calls, or they were getting angry on the phone with her. So there's kind of micro-level pushback also is a big part of it.
And Dr. Nelson, reading your testimony, I remember well after Hurricane Harvey and all the reports of it, environmental issues and spills and leaks in the Houston area, and part of your testimony is entitled "The Path to Poison." I think folks would be appalled to understand that after that, while you had the county grand jury indict executives of a corporate polluter, EPA did not take any enforcement action at all. Is that true?
Not to my knowledge.
what is, in your opinion, has happened with EPA's interest in enforcing our environmental laws?
I think EPA is behaving in a negligent manner, and communities in Houston and across the country are suffering the public health impacts as a result.
Thank you. Mr. Shaffer, given the downward trend of several key enforcement indicators, I'm worried that some cases at EPA may not be getting the attention they deserve. I understand your organization, the Environmental Integrity Project, has documented certain cases that you have concerns about. Walk us through a few of those examples.
Sure. We have, for example, 2 plants in Louisiana. In one case, the EPA inspectors found massive breakdowns in the compliance system that led to release of chloroprene, which is very toxic. It's a carcinogen, actually. The chloroprene levels downwind in the African American community that's been there forever are way higher than EPA thinks is safe. We have butadiene coming out of the Firestone Polymers plant because, according again to EPA inspectors, the company really had no idea what was escaping out of its production process. And we're talking here about thousands and thousands of pounds. These are not paperwork violations. These are not little things. This is a company that is in the business of making chemicals, and it should know when they get into the environment. I don't think that's too much to ask. These cases have been sitting for years. We've got many other examples. We've got lead being blown from facilities that aren't managing their lead emissions and causing the air quality to exceed health-based standards in communities downwind. Why are these cases, why have they not resulted yet, several years later, in some cases 3 or 4 years later, in an enforcement action? So you are always going to find these problems out there. If
Gentlelady's
you don't,
time's
you're not
expired.
looking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Tempest, we've heard some of the witnesses today criticize the administration's emphasis on cooperative federalism, implying that cooperative federalism will diminish or eliminate the EPA's role in controlling pollution. Is this how you understand cooperative federalism to work?
No, sir. I mean, EPA has a significant role in first establishing the rules. It has a significant role continuing and being able to investigate both civil and criminal violations, pursuing resolution of those cases. But it, as the name implies, cooperative federalism also involves a substantial and robust and important role for the states.
So the EPA's role is not eliminated, is it?
No.
And in these bad cases that we were just hearing about, the EPA can take action. Isn't that true?
I don't know the specifics of those cases, but generally, as a general matter, yes.
Well, it was interesting because I was listening, and it was, 3, 4 years. So obviously, it's not something new that has caused those problems that were just that were just mentioned. What do you think the benefits are of the EPA's enhancing its collaboration with state and tribal partners to enforce the environmental laws?
Well, I think you get a variety of things. One is EPA does have a level of expertise that it can, by working with the states, transfer to officials in those states as to the best practices for inspections, as to particular areas of concern, as to what the regulatory requirements are overall in discussing and making sure there's a clear understanding of those. So I think, on the one hand, that you get that. On the other hand, I think part of what undermines all federalism, cooperative or otherwise, is a recognition that often local officials know their communities best. And they have an appreciation for the facilities, they have appreciation for the issues in the community, and they probably have a sensitivity to and a level of contact with those facilities in a more regular way that just makes them knowledgeable and effective in trying to bring compliance to bear.
And in your opinion, how does cooperative federalism help promote a higher compliance rate?
Well, as I said, I think it primarily comes about through drawing on and making robust the capacity that the state has, those officials who are in their communities, in a regular way and making them effective in using all of the tools we've talked about. Again, not just enforcement actions, but inspections, self-report and auditing programs. The effectiveness comes about by making those state officials able to do their work in a sensible way.
And in many ways, I mean, if you have a bad actor, they're going to be bad actors no matter what. But for those people that are struggling in the medium-sized businesses or even in small and large businesses, if they're struggling to figure out, okay, what are the rules here? What do I need to do? If they're sensing, and you correct me if you think I'm wrong, if they're sensing that there's a no-win, and if they, you know, even if they try hard, they're not going to succeed and they're going to get fined or penalized, it just becomes an adversarial proceeding. Whereas if you're trying to help them, say, look, if you do it this way, things will be better, and we're not going to fine you, doesn't that get more cooperation as well? And isn't that part of what the EPA is trying to do right now?
My sense is that's part of what they're trying to do, and I would say just as a general matter for some of those, as you say, smaller entities that don't have necessarily the staff and the sophistication, they're trying hard. They want to follow the rules. Sometimes they can be quite complicated, and there is something to the fact that I think for a lot of folks in that situation, the federal government sounds big and scary. A state government agency feels like a place that they think they can go to and get that advice that they need to get them to the place they want to be, which is in compliance.
Yeah. In my district, you know, there are a lot of people, and I don't adhere to that, but a lot of people have advocated, you know, just will abolish the EPA because they feel so put down, burdened, oppressed that they just like forget it all. And yet I think the EPA can do some good things, and that's why I support what the EPA is currently trying to do and what you've advocated for here today. I appreciate it very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to start by thanking the witnesses for being here and your testimony and your service. And I wanted to begin by touching on the importance of deterring those bad actors, some of which my colleague just mentioned. I'm worried that the most recent EPA numbers, as we heard about earlier this morning, may send the wrong message to polluters, and that the agency is in fact failing to deter those future violations. So, Dr. Szymczak, to start with you, sir, your testimony touches on this point, and you've done some academic work in this area. Can you generally speak to the importance of deterrence and what approach to enforcement may be needed by the EPA to inhibit future environmental violations?
Sure. So deterrence, the fact that inspections and penalties have implications for deterring future violations is important not just to the sanction and inspection facility, but also there are spillover effects, what we call general deterrence of interventions. Those spillover effects of inspections and enforcement activities increase compliance and reduce pollution, among others. And deterrence effects can also reduce future pollution in beyond compliance behavior as well.
So for you, Doctor, and for Mr. Shaffer, what specific tools do you believe the EPA has in its arsenal to deter would-be polluters? And do you believe that they are currently effectively using them now? Dr. Szymczak first.
So I will say that the evidence suggests that interventions with teeth, fines are most effective. I otherwise defer to Dr. Shaffer, Mr. Shaffer, excuse me.
Well, EPA uses a mix of tools, and they have always included giving people compliance assistance and helping them to understand the rules of the road, and those are important. I think one of the most important things that EPA does as a national program is step in against, frankly, some of the biggest polluters with lots of political connections and power, and take enforcement actions that states will not or cannot because they don't have the capacity. And if EPA loses that ability, then we lose something very important.
Are you concerned they're not leveraging that capability?
I am concerned about the direction the agency is going in that way. And we have, again, examples of violations that are pretty serious at big plants that just seem to be sitting there and not getting attention.
And why is that, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I think there's a reluctance to enforce in this administration. I just have to put that on the table. There's a lot of talk about cooperative federalism. It has its value, but there are certain responsibilities that you can't just push on push off rather to the state agencies, and I think that's letting a lot of these violations just sit.
And Dr. Nelson, I wanted to see if you could chime in. You noted in your testimony that Texas does not penalize 97% of its air pollution violations. If that number's accurate, and I'm sure it is, the state either lacks the will or the capacity to deal with a lot of these issues, even during non-emergency times. So, Doctor, can you comment further on what it may mean if the state of Texas is failing to penalize air pollution violations, and how important it is for the EPA to deter bad actors, given the state may not always do so, building off of what Mr. Shaffer said?
So if I understand your question correctly, what are the implications of the state not enforcing?
Yeah, and any reason as to why you think a state would not enforce 97% of the violations that would come up?
I don't think that the culture supports the state enforcing much of the violations. I think the evidence speaks for itself. I think in terms of the implications of that, that communities on the ground are experiencing the public health impacts of the state not enforcing the laws of the Texas Clean Air Act. I don't think that it's cost efficient in a state like Texas for industry to comply with the law when the risk of being caught is low, and even if they are caught, the risk of penalty and the penalties are so low as well. So the state of Texas can penalize facilities for $25,000 per day per violation, and in that most recent report, they collected $1.2 million, which is about 2 cents per pound of the pollution that was released.
Doctor, if going off of what I think somebody taught me in law school way back when, if you judge the strength of the law by the power of its remedy, and you've got remedies in place, but the state just chooses not to enforce it, is there really any regulation to begin with?
Well, the regulation exists. I think the burden is on the state agency and the state legislature to make it effective.
And if there's no cost for compliance?
If there is no cost for compliance, again, I think that industry is going to behave in a manner that maximizes its bottom line until it's forced not to.
Thank you. Yield to Ms. Custer. Seeing no more Republican witness. Ms. Custer, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'll start with Dr. Sellers, if I could. The report you contributed to says, quote, EPA employees point to budgetary uncertainty and staff loss as factors that help explain the downturn in enforcement under the Trump administration. Given the budgetary uncertainty and loss of staff that we've been discussing here today, what did EPA employees tell you about EPA's ability to enforce environmental laws? And if you could give us one or two examples about how EPA was unable to go after polluters because of understaffing or this approach.
Sure, yeah. All the employees that we spoke with mentioned this factor about losing staff. I mean, there's been the gradual attrition, and then there's, on top of that, the buyouts and so on.
Does that cause a lack of morale?
It does. I mean, it doesn't send a positive message. I think some of the departures are because people got that message and decided to leave. In terms of the kinds of things that are being lost, I could give you an example, for instance, of someone who was in charge of the asbestos program at the enforcement who left in one of these departures, and there was no exchange of knowledge. There was no effort. He had been there 20 years. He was kind of the expert on this area, and it was not passed along. So EPA is now at a loss, and there's a big hole there in terms of what EPA can offer, even just an advisory capacity to industry, much less issues of enforcement.
Thank you. And I'm going to direct this at Mr. Shaffer, but to continue on that same theme, returning to my questions this morning, we, in my district, a town called Litchfield, New Hampshire, had an incident of per and polyfluorinated compounds, PFAs, caused by a company, St. Gobin's. And I discussed this morning that we've had to spend millions of dollars to hook up these households in this community to clean water because their wells are contaminated. They were on bottled water the whole time while they waited for that to happen. In our case, we were fortunate that it did happen, but I noticed there was an action plan released on PFAS last week from the EPA, but it doesn't seem to include any action, despite being called an action plan. While EPA officials said they intend to move forward with maximum contaminant levels, there's no commitment in the plan. And I'm just curious about your response to that. And if you could comment, the witness this morning talked a great deal about voluntary disclosures, and we've been given charts that the voluntary disclosures are going up. How can we count on these companies to voluntarily disclose what they know about the contaminants that they put into our soil and our water and our air? And are we doing what's needed to keep American families safe?
So, Congressman, I don't know the specific facts of the New Hampshire case. I just say in general, you're fundamental to enforcement, and I would say just to justice, is the responsible parties should pay for the problems they created, and enforcement has a huge role in that. And so I would look for that in any EPA strategy to deal with these contaminants. I think that would be really, really important. The government does, and I was there, I was part of this, the government rolls out a lot of plans and makes a lot of announcements. What you should look for are deadlines and numerical targets and specific outcomes.
And some type of timetable.
Yes.
And when I asked her about the timetable this morning, she said, oh, I'll have to get back to you on that. There is no timetable, as far as I can tell.
And maybe they will come back with a timetable, and it's great that you push for one. I think government benefits from that kind of push. But without that, without deadlines, not much happens in government agencies.
And what's your experience, just in my waning time here, with companies voluntarily disclosing that they've had massive incidents of pollution, knowing that if they were caught, if there was remedy, they would be on the hook to pay for that?
Well, I think, in my experience, you can get those kinds of voluntary closures when you have a strong enforcement program and people understand the consequences of not coming forward. They also want to know their competitors will be treated more or less the same way. If you don't have that level playing field, then you come forward, cut your deal to clean the mess up, and you're looking sideways at your competitors, you don't see that happen, then your voluntary compliance will fall off the cliff.
And given Dr. Nelson's comment about state by state, if you're in a state with very low compliance activity, why would you? I mean, you're going to put yourself at a competitive disadvantage. So, well, thanks to all of you for coming in today. We appreciate it. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for yielding back. I'm going to yield 5 minutes to myself for questions. I want to thank you all for being here today. Appreciate your testimony. I want to come back, as I was this morning, and talk about injunctive relief. And obviously, this is a really critical enforcement tool. It's saying to industries, it's saying to violators, it's saying to polluters, you need to adopt a different way of behaving. You have to come in compliance with certain rules. There are costs associated with that. Mr. Buckheit and Mr. Shaffer, as former EPA enforcement officials, tell me why you view this within the toolkit that's available to the EPA as such a critical enforcement mechanism.
Well, the EPA's enforcement program is not about collecting money for the Treasury. It's about protecting public health. Fines are a part of that, but the really important part of that is what measures are installed to reduce pollution as a result of your actions. And the surrogate for that is the dollar amount of the injunctive relief. That reflects the amount that must be invested, which is directly related to the pollution reduction.
Mr. Shaffer?
I think that answers directly. I think injunctive relief captures the cost of cleanup. When you see bigger commitments, that tells you that you're finding the right cases. You're finding the most serious problems. where you need companies to make a real long-term investment in cleanup.
So I want to go back to the numbers a little bit, because in fiscal year 2018, the EPA enforcement actions, injunctive relief actions, resulted in $3.9 billion in injunctive relief. According to Christian Science Monitor, this figure is the lowest in 15 years. And in that same article, it was indicated that 40% of that total comes from cases that were settled by the EPA during the Obama administration, which means that the fiscal year 2018 numbers could have been worse. And I understand that when you capture these things makes a difference. You have to look at what the window is and so forth. But in any event, given what you know, Mr. Shaffer, Mr. Buckheit, about this and these numbers that I just read to you, I'm curious just to get your thoughts on the 2018 numbers. What do you think they mean? And frankly, is it sending some kind of signal to industry? And how are they interpreting that signal?
Obviously, you know, to state the obvious, they mean that there's less activity to reduce pollution coming out of the air. What I think is happening here is a pipeline issue. You see a number of years of fairly robust activity under the Obama administration, and you've heard different witnesses talk about how it takes a period of time to build and maintain this pipeline of cases that will go through the system. What I saw in the enforcement policies was, I think, that the administration is cutting off activity, except for matters that are already referred to the Justice Department, in the 4 key sectors that had been identified as priorities. And so I think that then creates a gap in the pipeline, which then leads to the lower numbers in the bigger cases.
Which means we could see this trend continuing.
I think so.
In the future, because the number of initiatives are being undertaken now, we'll see the results or lack of results of that further down the pipeline.
I fully agree, and I note that they don't have any sectors that they're focusing on for future activities, you know, which big industrial sectors.
Mr. Shaffer, do you have any comments on kind of how the industry is going to interpret
I think
this?
that's a complete answer. And to be fair, the total value of injunctive relief in any one year can be affected by 1 or 2 very large cases. But even controlling for those outliers, it's a pretty substantial drop, and I agree with Bruce that it reflects the fact that kind of less is being put in to enforcement than used to be, and sooner or later that plays out in declining results.
And again, I just want to emphasize before I close here that if this isn't being exercised properly as an enforcement tool, it is sending a signal to industry that, in a sense, the cop is off the beat. They don't have to be as conscientious about the measures that need to be undertaken here. Whether they were inclined to do that or not, absent somebody leaning on them, is a different question, but overall, that's not good signaling to have. Thank you all very much. Now I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Congressman Tonko.
Thank you there, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Shaffer, as I understand it, civil penalties are an important EPA enforcement tool. I heard some of this last exchange and find it interesting. The penalties are monetary assessments, obviously, paid by a regulated entity because of a violation or noncompliance. They are designed to recover the financial benefit a company has obtained by breaking the law, and they impose added costs to deter firms from breaking the law again in the future. So my question to you is, very briefly, could you explain why civil penalties are an important enforcement tool for EPA?
It has to cost you more when you violate the law. You know, it has to cost you more if you violate the law and ignore it than not. If there's no sanction, nothing hits your pocketbook when you fail to comply with your pollution limits, then you have less incentive to comply. Some companies, better management will continue to try to do that, but slowly the system erodes if people realize you never have to pay anything for violating the law.
Thank you. And then again, Mr. Shaffer, according to EPA's annual enforcement report for fiscal year 2018, EPA obtained just over $69 million in federal administrative and civil judicial penalties last year. The Washington Post noted that the number of civil penalties assessed was the lowest since the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance was established back in 1994. While that seems troubling on its face, I will hold up a chart that I did in the last, for Administrator Boudin, that adding now 2019 to date, and most of that spike, a huge spike, but it's explained, I believe, by the Fiat Chrysler situation. So now we've asked for information we hope to receive relatively soon, what the impact of 2019 is if you take that Fiat Chrysler out of the picture. So troubling certainly on the face. Is it a legitimate concern that we ought to have about those numbers?
Well, I think you can take Fiat out, and you can also take out the very large, once in a great while penalties, like in the one for the
BP and VW.
right?
And this chart was adjusted for that.
Right. If you if you do take those outliers out, I think you will still see a decline in 2018, and perhaps continuing into 2019 as well.
And Mr. Buckheit and Dr. Sellers, do you have any thoughts on what the latest civil enforcement numbers mean? Like those that I just shared? It seems like we had a few cases that drove things, especially now in 2019.
I totally agree that, the reduction in numbers, these numbers, reflects badly on the program. And I would just add a comment about the mobile source enforcement numbers. It's a good thing that the administration is doing this and assessing a large fine. But you have to keep in mind that California has its own independent enforcement authorities, and California is pursuing this and getting a per-vehicle penalty associated with it. So again, kudos to the administration for getting involved in doing this, but it's a little bit, it's led by California in terms of pushing towards those large numbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just say that it's a mistake just to focus on the kinds of enforcement numbers that do have these big penalties or these big chunks that distort the data. If you look at all the other data that is not distorted by that kind of sum, and that's most of it, then the declines are even more marked and unmistakable. So that was what it was.
Thank you. And Dr. Shimshak and Mr. Shaffer, do you believe focusing on compliance assistance is a suitable substitute? Now, I heard some of that exchange that you had, but as a suitable is it a suitable substitute for enforcement activities such as issuing civil penalties?
Certainly not. Compliance assistance is very important. A serious violation, unless there are some extenuating circumstances, especially by large companies with deep pockets, they should pay. There's no conflict between compliance assistance and enforcement. You need both.
Okay, Dr. Shimshak?
My view is that they're complementary and not appropriate as substitutes for one another.
Okay. Well, many of us are concerned about the mission statement of EPA taken somewhat lightly, and the improvements we've made through the years and some of the other concerns coming before them, as my colleague from New Hampshire raised with PFAS. There is real concern that the enforcement of these statutes and various programs become very, very critical to the quality of life in the communities that we all represent. And so I thank you all for sharing your thoughts today. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. The charts that Mr. Tonko was referring to are part of a package of charts that were provided to both Democratic and Republican staffs by the EPA when we were being briefed. Ms. Castor also referred to one of these charts. And so I'm going to ask unanimous consent to put these charts into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank all the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing, and I want to remind the members that pursuant to committee rules, you have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by witnesses who have appeared before the subcommittee. I would ask all of you, if you do get these questions, to please respond as quickly as possible. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Good job.